Before the first prayer was whispered into the darkness of night, before the first temple stone was laid upon sacred ground, there were mysteries that walked among us like shadows cast by no earthly light. They moved through ancient valleys where civilizations rose and fell like gentle waves, carrying with them secrets that were never meant to be solved, only witnessed. Tonight, we journey not to disturb these sleeping enigmas, but to rest within their tender embrace. Not to wake the slumbering truths, but to sleep alongside them in the quiet spaces between questions and answers. Let us begin. Slowly, softly, like pilgrims walking barefoot on hallowed ground. You stand now where water once covered the world, in a place where memory itself seems to hold its breath. The air is thick with the weight of centuries, and if you listen carefully, you can almost hear the whispers of temples that existed before. The great deluge, structures so sacred they were said to bridge the space between heaven and earth, reaching upward like prayers made of stone and mortar. These were not ordinary buildings, not simple places of worship as we might understand them today. Ancient texts speak of temples that hummed with a frequency that matched the heartbeat of the divine, their walls inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift and change depending on the spiritual state of those who gazed upon them. The priests, who served in these holy places, were said to possess knowledge that came not from books or teachings, but from direct communion with forces that governed the movement of stars and the turning of seasons. You walk through the silence where these temples once stood, your footsteps muffled by the soft earth that has drunk deeply of rain and time. Archaeological fragments scattered across Mesopotamian plains hint at construction techniques that remain unexplained. Stones fitted together with such precision that not even the thinnest blade could slip between them, yet showing no evidence of the tools that might have shaped them so perfectly. The flood narratives that echo through Sumerian, Babylonian, and Hebrew traditions speak not just of rising waters, but of a deliberate concealment. These stories suggest that certain knowledge was too powerful for the post-flood world, too dangerous for civilizations that would rebuild from scattered survivors. The temples, with their libraries of wisdom carved in stone and their altars where heaven touched earth, were allowed to sink beneath the waves, not by accident, but by divine design. In cuneiform tablets that survived the waters, scribes wrote of ceremonies conducted in the highest chambers of these temples, rituals that allegedly allowed human consciousness to expand beyond the boundaries of physical existence. They described priests who would fast for months, not to weaken their bodies, but to strengthen their ability to perceive dimensions that overlapped with our own. These weren't metaphorical descriptions. The texts provide specific measurements, architectural details, and even dietary preparations for those who would attempt such transcendence. The mystery deepens when you consider that these pre-flood temples appear to have been constructed according to mathematical principles that wouldn't be discovered by human civilization for thousands of years. Golden ratios, complex geometric harmonies, and astronomical alignments that demonstrate knowledge of celestial mechanics that our ancestors supposedly didn't possess. Yet there they were, embedded in stone, as if the builders were working from blueprints provided by sources beyond human understanding. Local legends, still whispered in the regions where these temples once stood, speak of nights when the waters become unusually still, when fishermen report seeing lights beneath the surface that pulse in rhythm with ancient hymns. These aren't stories of ghosts or spirits, but something more profound. Suggestions that the sacred energy of these places transcended their physical destruction, continuing to exist in forms that occasionally brush against our reality like memories that refuse to fade. As you stand in this place where water and earth remember what humanity has forgotten, You feel the weight of questions that have no answers, only deeper questions. What knowledge did these temples protect? What wisdom was deemed too powerful for the world that emerged from the flood's retreat? And most mysteriously of all, if these sacred sites were deliberately hidden, who made that choice? And what were they protecting us from? The waters recede, but the desert remembers what the flood forgot. The desert stretches before you like an ocean of sand and silence, where the Egyptian sun has baked the earth into a canvas of gold and amber. Here, in caves carved into limestone cliffs that rise like ancient sentinels from the desert floor, you discover the remnants of hermit monks who claimed that stones would whisper back divine secrets to those who knew how to listen. These were not madmen driven to solitude by the harsh beauty of the wilderness. Historical records describe them as scholars who abandoned the libraries of Alexandria and Constantinople, men who possessed such profound learning that their contemporaries sought their counsel on matters of theology and philosophy. Yet they chose to retreat into the desert's embrace, claiming that the accumulated wisdom of human civilization was merely preparation for a deeper education that could only be received in the silence between heartbeats. You enter one of their caves, your fingers tracing inscriptions carved into walls that seem to pulse with their own inner light. The writings describe conversations, actual dialogues, between these desert fathers and the stones themselves. Not symbolic communications or metaphorical interactions, but detailed records of questions asked and answers received, written in the precise, methodical language of scholars documenting empirical observations. Brother Macarius of the Eastern Desert, whose writings survived in fragments hidden within monastery walls, described his first conversation with a granite boulder that had rested in his cave for what geological evidence suggested was thousands of years. He wrote of preparing himself through 40 days of fasting and prayer, not to induce hallucinations, but to achieve a state of consciousness that could perceive the subtle vibrations that stones allegedly emit when addressed with the proper spiritual frequency. The methodology these monks developed was remarkably sophisticated. They identified specific types of stone that seemed most responsive to human consciousness, certain quartzite formations, limestone deposits with particular mineral compositions, and especially meteorite fragments that had fallen from the heavens. They documented the times of day when these stone conversations were most successful, the phases of the moon that seemed to enhance the phenomenon, and even the specific prayers and meditative techniques that appeared necessary for initiating contact. What emerges from their careful records is not mystical rambling, but something resembling early experimental science applied to spiritual phenomena. They tested variables, recorded results, and developed increasingly refined techniques for what they termed geological communion. Their writings suggest that stones, being among the Earth's oldest formations, retained memories of events that occurred across vast spans of time, not conscious memories as humans experience them, but imprinted vibrations that could be accessed by minds trained in the proper receptive techniques. The knowledge these monks claimed to receive from their stone teachers covered subjects that ranged from forgotten historical events to prophetic insights about future spiritual developments. They wrote of learning about civilizations that existed before recorded history, of understanding natural disasters and their spiritual significance, and of receiving guidance for personal spiritual development that proved remarkably effective in their continued growth toward enlightenment. Brother Evagrius, whose cave you now explore, left behind the most detailed accounts of these practices. His writings describe stones that would grow warm to the touch during successful communications, others that would emit barely audible tones, and still others that seemed to project images directly into the mind of the listener. He documented conversations that lasted for hours during which single stones would provide complex theological insights that helped resolve disputes that had puzzled church scholars for decades. The mystery deepens when you consider that these monks were eventually recalled to mainstream monastic communities, their practices deemed too unusual even for the tolerant early Christian church. Their techniques for stone communication were never formally condemned, but they were quietly discouraged, and the knowledge they had accumulated was allowed to fade into obscurity. Their caves were abandoned, their writings scattered, and their remarkable claims relegated to the category of desert folklore. Yet physical evidence remains that suggests their practices involved more than imagination or spiritual delusion. Modern archaeological investigation of their caves has revealed acoustic properties that could amplify even the slightest vibrations, mineral formations that exhibit unusual electromagnetic characteristics, and stone surfaces that show patterns of wear consistent with repeated handling during what appear to have been ritual interactions. As you sit in the cooling desert evening, surrounded by the stones that once whispered secrets to devoted listeners, you feel the profound silence that follows when conversations end. The monks are gone, their voices stilled, but the stones remain, patient, ancient, and possibly still holding within their mineral memories the wisdom they once shared with those who knew how to ask the right questions in the right way. From Desert Whispers, we journey to where the earth itself holds memory. Beneath Turkey's otherworldly landscape, where volcanic eruptions long ago sculpted stone into fairy chimneys and honeycomb hills, you descend through narrow passages into hand-carved cities that burrow deep into the Earth's embrace. Here, in the soft volcanic rock called tuff, early Christians created not merely hiding places but elaborate underground cathedrals designed for forms of worship that history cannot adequately explain. You move through tunnels that wind downward like a spiral prayer, their walls bearing the marks of countless hands that shaped them with tools and techniques that remain mysteriously sophisticated. These weren't crude excavations carved out of desperate necessity, but carefully planned architectural marvels that demonstrate engineering knowledge that seems almost impossibly advanced for their supposed time period. The cities extend as deep as 18 levels below ground, with ventilation systems that maintain perfect air circulation and water management systems that continue to function after more than 1,000 years. The religious spaces carved into these depths reveal practices that diverge significantly from mainstream early Christianity. You enter vast underground chambers where ceiling frescoes depict scenes that don't appear in canonical Gospels, images of figures floating in meditation, geometric patterns that seem to induce altered states of consciousness when studied closely, and symbols that blend Christian iconography with older traditions that predate Christianity by centuries. Archaeological evidence suggests that these underground communities practiced a form of collective worship that required complete isolation from the world above. The chambers are designed with acoustic properties that would amplify whispered prayers into harmonic resonances that fill the entire space, creating an auditory environment that modern sound engineers recognize as naturally conducive to meditative trance states. The positioning of altar spaces, the precise angles of carved niches, and the mathematical relationships between different chambers all suggest deliberate design intended to facilitate specific types of consciousness, altering religious experience. Brother Methodius, a Byzantine chronicler whose writings survived in monastery archives, described visiting these underground communities during the 8th century. His accounts, written with the careful precision of a trained observer, detail worship services that lasted for days, during which participants claimed to experience direct visions of divine realms. These weren't descriptions of emotional religious experiences, but detailed reports of what the communities believed were actual journeys to other dimensions of existence. The most intriguing chambers you discover are those that show evidence of having been used for rituals involving what the communities called Earth Communion. These spaces contain carved depressions in the floor filled with specific combinations of minerals and soil from various sacred sites around the Mediterranean. The practitioners apparently believed that by lying in these earth-filled spaces during their extended prayers, they could access what they termed geological memory, the accumulated spiritual imprint of all the prayers, meditations, and sacred ceremonies that had ever been performed on the earth above. The underground churches also contain libraries carved directly into the rock walls, filled with texts that present versions of Christian theology that differ significantly from Orthodox teachings. These weren't heretical documents in the conventional sense, but sophisticated theological treatises that suggest these communities had access to source materials or interpretive traditions that were unknown to surface Christianity. The texts describe Jesus' teachings in ways that emphasize techniques for consciousness expansion and direct mystical experience rather than moral instruction or salvation theology. What makes these communities particularly mysterious is that they seem to practice a form of Christianity that was both more ancient and more advanced than the religion being developed by mainstream churches. Their practices suggest connections to pre-Christian mystery traditions, yet their theology demonstrates understanding of Christian concepts that wouldn't be formally developed for centuries. They appear to have been practicing a form of Christianity that had evolved independently, guided by sources and insights that the surface world never received. The abandonment of these underground cities remains unexplained. Historical records suggest they weren't destroyed by persecution or invasion, but were voluntarily evacuated by their inhabitants, who sealed the entrances behind them and disappeared into history without leaving clear traces of where they went or why they left. Some chambers show evidence of having been carefully preserved before abandonment, as if the communities expected to return someday, while others appear to have been deliberately obscured, their most sacred spaces filled with rubble to prevent future discovery. Modern investigations using ground-penetrating radar have revealed that many of these underground complexes extend far deeper than previously suspected, with sealed chambers and tunnels that haven't been opened for over 1,000 years. The deepest levels remain inaccessible, their secrets locked behind carefully constructed barriers that suggest the communities possessed knowledge or artifacts they considered too powerful or sacred to risk being discovered by the surface world. As you ascend from these depths back toward daylight, you carry with you the weight of questions that seem to grow heavier with each step upward. What forms of worship required such elaborate isolation? What knowledge did these communities possess that made them seal their most sacred spaces before disappearing? And most intriguingly, what lies in those deepest chambers that they deemed necessary to protect from all future discovery? As we rise from underground chambers, the mountains call with their own sacred riddles. You climb through clouds that cling to mountain peaks like the breath of sleeping gods, following paths that wind upward through air so thin that each step becomes a meditation on the simple act of breathing. Here, in the Himalayan vastness where Earth reaches toward heaven with stone fingers, local legends speak of a Tibetan monastery that cartographers mapped for centuries, yet modern expeditions cannot find. The monastery of Shambhala Ling, according to records kept by British surveyors, during the colonial period, stood at an elevation of approximately 16,000 feet, built into a natural amphitheater of granite that provided protection from the fierce winds that scour these heights. The maps show precise coordinates, detailed sketches of the building's distinctive architecture, and even notes about the number of monks in residence during various survey expeditions. Yet when modern mountaineers and archaeologists attempt to reach these documented locations, they find only empty stone and swirling mist. The mystery deepens when you examine the consistency of historical accounts. Multiple independent sources, British explorers, Russian geographers, even early Jesuit missionaries, provided remarkably similar descriptions of the monastery's appearance and the unusual practices of its inhabitants. They wrote of monks who had developed meditative techniques so advanced that they could allegedly control their body temperature precisely enough to melt snow through the heat generated by focused concentration, a practice they called tummo, that has since been verified as genuinely possible by modern physiological research. But the accounts describe abilities that go far beyond documented tummo practices. These monks allegedly demonstrated what observers called translucency meditation, the ability to make their physical bodies partially transparent through techniques that involved synchronized breathing with what they termed the mountain's own breath. Multiple witnesses, writing independently and separated by decades, described seeing monks who appeared to fade in and out of visibility during their deepest meditative states, becoming so attuned to the thin air and ethereal environment of extreme altitude that they seemed to exist partially in our physical dimension and partially in some other realm of being. The monastery's library, according to these historical accounts, contained texts written in a script that linguistic scholars couldn't identify, not variations of Tibetan Sanskrit or any known Asian writing system, but something entirely unique that the monks claimed had been dictated to them during their transcendental meditative experiences. These texts allegedly contained detailed maps not of geographical territories, but of what the monks called consciousness territories, different levels and dimensions of awareness that could be accessed through specific combinations of meditation, breath control, and ritual practices performed at precise altitudes where the physical and spiritual worlds intersected most closely. The most intriguing accounts come from Dr. Alexandra David Néel, the French explorer who spent extensive time in Tibet during the early 20th century. Her detailed journals describe visiting Shambhala Ling during a winter expedition in 1924, when she was offered shelter during a sudden blizzard that had made further travel impossible. She wrote of monks who seemed to anticipate her arrival despite her having told no one of her planned route, and who demonstrated what she carefully described as controlled dematerialization, the ability to make objects disappear and reappear through methods that involved no visible manipulation or sleight of hand. Dr. David Néel's scientific background makes her testimony particularly compelling. She approached these phenomena with the skeptical eye of a trained anthropologist, testing and observing with the rigor of academic research. Yet her journals record experiences that challenged her understanding of physical reality. She described participating in a ceremony where the monks allegedly opened what they called dimensional windows, spaces in the air itself that became transparent, revealing landscapes that bore no resemblance to the Himalayan environment surrounding the monastery. The monks explained to her that their monastery existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions, and that their meditative practices had advanced to the point where they could consciously choose which dimensional level to inhabit. At any given time, they claimed that the physical monastery she was visiting was merely one manifestation of a spiritual community that extended across several parallel realities, and that their ultimate goal was to achieve such complete mastery over dimensional existence that they could transcend the need for any fixed physical location. This explanation would account for the monastery's mysterious appearances and disappearances in historical records. Rather than having been destroyed or abandoned, it may have achieved its goal of transcending singular dimensional existence, becoming visible only when its inhabitants chose to manifest in our particular reality. The monks' practice wasn't aimed at escaping the physical world, but at mastering the ability to exist consciously across multiple levels of reality simultaneously. Modern attempts to locate the monastery have employed satellite imagery, GPS technology, and systematic grid searches of the documented coordinates, yet find no trace of structures that should be visible if you climb through clouds that cling to mountain peaks like the breath of sleeping gods, following paths that wind upward through air so thin that each step becomes a meditation on the simple act of breathing. Here, in the Himalayan vastness where earth reaches toward heaven with stone fingers, local legends speak of a Tibetan monastery that cartographers mapped for centuries, yet modern expeditions cannot find. The monastery of Shambhala Ling, according to records kept by British surveyors, during the colonial period, stood at an elevation of approximately 16,000 feet, built into a natural amphitheatre of granite that provided protection from the fierce winds that scour these heights. The maps show precise coordinates, detailed sketches of the building's distinctive architecture, and even notes about the number of monks in residence during various survey expeditions. Yet when modern mountaineers and archaeologists attempt to reach these documented locations, they find only empty stone and swirling mist. The mystery deepens when you examine the consistency of historical accounts. Multiple independent sources, British explorers, Russian geographers, even early Jesuit missionaries, provided remarkably similar descriptions of the monastery's appearance and the unusual practices of its inhabitants. They wrote of monks who had developed meditative techniques so advanced that they could allegedly control their body temperature precisely enough to melt snow through the heat generated by focused concentration, a practice you float above waters so blue they seem to hold pieces of the sky itself suspended on the mirror surface of Lake Titicaca, where the thin air of high altitude makes every breath a conscious act of connection with the ancient world. Here, at 12,500 feet above sea level, straddling the border between Peru and Bolivia, lies a body of water that indigenous peoples have considered sacred for thousands of years, and beneath its deceptively peaceful surface rest stone structures that predate all known Andean civilizations. The lake stretches before you like an inland sea, its waters so clear in certain areas that local fishermen report being able to see the outlines of walls and terraces at depths that should render such visibility impossible. These aren't recent sinkings or natural formations, but carefully constructed stone complexes that show evidence of architectural sophistication that challenges our understanding of pre-Columbian South American spiritual traditions. Underwater, archaeological surveys conducted with modern sonar equipment have revealed structures that extend across several acres of the lake floor, arranged in patterns that suggest a planned ceremonial complex rather than a simple settlement. The largest structure appears to be a cathedral-like building, with walls that rise nearly 60 feet from the lake bottom, constructed from precisely fitted stone blocks that show no evidence of the metal tools that conventional archaeology assumes would have been necessary for such construction. Local Aymara legends, passed down through oral tradition for over 1,000 years, speak of these structures not as ruins of a lost civilization, but as the remnants of what they call the temple, where water and sky were married. According to these traditional accounts, the complex wasn't built on dry land that was later flooded, but was constructed specifically to exist partially underwater, designed for religious ceremonies that required the unique spiritual properties of submersion in sacred waters. The indigenous water priests who served in this underwater temple allegedly practiced rituals that modern understanding of physics suggests should have been impossible. They were said to be able to breathe underwater for extended periods not through any form of apparatus, but through meditative techniques that allowed their bodies to extract oxygen directly from the water around them. Spanish colonial records, written by missionaries who initially dismissed such claims as pagan superstition, later documented witnessing these practices firsthand and were forced to admit that they had observed phenomena that their European understanding of human physiology couldn't explain. The temple complex appears to have been designed around what the Aymara called water meditation, spiritual practices that involve descending to specific depths where water pressure and limited light would induce altered states of consciousness. The priests who practiced these underwater meditations claimed that the pressure of deep water combined with the sacred nature of Lake Titicaca's mineral-rich composition created conditions where human consciousness could expand beyond normal limitations and receive direct communication from what they termed the water spirits. These weren't animistic beliefs in the conventional sense, but sophisticated theological concepts that viewed water as a medium for spiritual transmission. The priests developed detailed theories about how different depths, water temperatures, and seasonal variations in the lake's mineral content affected the quality and intensity of spiritual experiences that could be achieved through underwater meditation. Their practices required years of training to develop the physical and mental disciplines necessary for extended submersion while maintaining the consciousness required for deep spiritual work. Archaeological evidence suggests that the underwater temple was connected to surface facilities through a network of air-filled chambers that allowed priests to descend gradually, adjusting to increasing water pressure while maintaining the ability to breathe. These chambers were positioned at precise depths that created acoustic properties that amplified and transmitted sound waves through the water in ways that allowed communication between surface and submerged worshippers during ceremonies. What most intriguing discovery is a series of carved channels that appear to have been designed to direct underwater currents in patterns that created specific vibrational frequencies throughout the temple complex. Modern acoustic analysis suggests that these current channels would have generated subsonic harmonics that could induce meditative states in human beings exposed to them, essentially turning the entire underwater structure into a massive instrument. Designed to facilitate altered consciousness through precisely controlled sound vibrations transmitted through water. The religious significance of these underwater practices centered around what the Aymara priests called the breathing of the earth. They believed that Lake Titicaca was actually a lung of the planet itself, inhaling and exhaling cosmic energy through daily and seasonal cycles that could be directly experienced by human consciousness that had been properly prepared through underwater meditation. The priests claimed that by synchronizing their own breathing with these planetary rhythms while submerged in the sacred waters, they could achieve direct communion with the spiritual forces that govern natural cycles and cosmic harmonies. Spanish. Colonial documents describe ceremonies that took place during specific lunar phases when large numbers of priests would descend simultaneously into the underwater temple, remaining submerged for periods that witnesses timed as lasting several hours. The surface of the lake during these ceremonies was reported to glow with phosphorescent light that had no apparent natural source, and the water itself seemed to vibrate with energy that could be felt by people standing on the shoreline hundreds of meters away. The abandonment of the underwater temple corresponds with the Spanish conquest, but not in the way that might be expected. Rather than being destroyed by colonial forces, the temple appears to have been deliberately sealed by its own priests who filled certain chambers with stones and clay in patterns that suggest they were preparing the complex for some future time when it might be safely reopened. The sealing work shows evidence of having been performed by people with intimate knowledge of the temple's construction, working systematically to preserve rather than destroy. Modern diving expeditions have discovered that some of the sealed chambers contain artifacts that remain perfectly preserved in the lake's cold, mineral-rich waters. These include stone tablets covered with symbols that don't match any known Andean writing system, ceramic vessels designed with acoustic properties that suggest they were used for underwater sound ceremonies, and metal objects made from alloys. that contain elements not known to exist naturally in the region surrounding Lake Titicaca. As you drift on the lake's surface, watching sunlight penetrate the clear water and illuminate the stone walls that rest in their underwater silence, you feel the weight of mysteries that sink deeper than any diving equipment can reach. The water itself seems to hold memories of ceremonies that bridged the gap between human consciousness and planetary awareness, of priests who learned to breathe liquid light and speak with the voice of the earth itself. Water preserves what time erodes, but ice holds memories even longer. In the world's furthest north, where winter reigns for months without yielding to spring's gentle promises, you witness the remnants of spiritual practices that existed at the very edge of human survival. Here, where the aurora borealis dances across skies that seem close enough to touch, Arctic shamans once created temporary art on ice sheets, believing these frozen canvases carried prayers directly to the spirit world through the medium of water, transformed by cold into crystalline galleries of the sacred. The landscape spreads before you in shades of white and blue that have no names in warmer languages, an environment so austere that human presence seems like an intrusion upon conversations between wind and ice that have continued uninterrupted for millennia. Yet it was precisely this harsh purity that drew certain indigenous shamans to develop spiritual practices that could exist nowhere else on Earth. Practices that required the unique properties of ice that forms at temperatures so extreme that the water itself enters states of crystallization unknown in temperate climates. Early Arctic explorers, writing in journals they kept to maintain sanity during the endless polar nights, described encountering indigenous shamans who would spend days preparing surfaces of sea ice for what they called spirit painting. These weren't simple artistic endeavors, but complex religious ceremonies that required precise understanding of ice formation, weather patterns, and the shamanic belief systems that guided every aspect of life in environments where survival depended on maintaining harmony with forces that could kill the unprepared within hours of exposure. The shamans would select ice sheets based on criteria that combined practical knowledge with spiritual insight, ice that had formed during specific weather conditions, at particular times in the lunar cycle, and in locations where the shamans believed the boundary between the physical and spirit worlds became thin enough for communication to pass through. The preparation of these ice canvases involved techniques that required skills passed down through generations, knowledge of how to work with frozen surfaces that would accept the natural pigments extracted from Arctic plants, animal blood, and mineral deposits found in the brief summers when the land revealed itself from beneath its winter covering. The paintings themselves were described by witnesses as being of extraordinary beauty and complexity, covering areas of ice that stretched for hundreds of square feet with images that seemed to move and shift as the viewing angle changed and the Arctic light played across their crystalline surfaces. The shamans used techniques that took advantage of ice's natural optical properties, creating layered images that appeared different when viewed from various distances and at different times of day, as the position of the sun altered the way light penetrated and reflected through the frozen medium. Dr. Knud Rasmussen, the Danish polar explorer, whose ethnographic work among Arctic peoples provides some of the most detailed accounts of these practices, described participating in ice painting ceremonies during his extensive travels in the early 20th century. His journals record the painstaking process by which shamans would prepare themselves physically and spiritually for the work, fasting and purifying themselves through sweat lodge ceremonies adapted for Arctic conditions, then spending days in meditation on the spiritual significance of the images they intended to create. The subject matter of these ice paintings wasn't decorative or narrative in the conventional sense, but consisted of what the shamans called spirit maps, complex geometric and organic patterns that allegedly corresponded to the invisible pathways through which spiritual energy moved between the physical world and the realm of ancestors and helping spirits. The shamans explained that by creating these maps on ice, they were providing temporary physical forms that spiritual entities could use as landing points when traveling between dimensions, essentially creating doorways that allowed communication between human consciousness and the vast spiritual forces that governed Arctic survival. The most remarkable aspect of these ice paintings was their deliberate impermanence. The shamans created them with full knowledge that they would last only as long as the weather conditions remained stable, usually a matter of days or weeks before wind, temperature changes, or shifting ice would destroy their work completely. This wasn't seen as a limitation, but as an essential element of the spiritual practice. The temporary nature of the paintings reflected the shamanic understanding that all spiritual communication was necessarily fleeting, requiring constant renewal and recreation rather than permanent physical monuments. The shamans explained to Dr. Rasmussen that the act of creating the ice paintings was itself a form of prayer, but that the spiritual work wasn't complete until the paintings were allowed to return to their natural state through the action of wind and weather. They believed that as the ice paintings were destroyed by natural forces, the spiritual energy they contained was released and carried by wind currents to the spirit world, delivering the prayers and requests that had been embedded in the images during their creation. The pigments used for these ice paintings were themselves considered sacred substances, prepared through rituals that connected their gathering and preparation to the spiritual intentions of the finished work. Arctic plant materials were harvested during the brief summer months and processed through techniques that preserved not only their coloring properties, but what the shamans believed were their spiritual essences. Animal blood used in the painting came from creatures that had been hunted according to strict spiritual protocols, with the understanding that the animal's spirit would participate in the communication with the spirit world through the medium of the ice paintings. Modern attempts to recreate these ice painting techniques have met with limited success, partly because the specific environmental conditions required are difficult to reproduce, but also because contemporary researchers lack the generations of accumulated knowledge about ice behavior, Arctic weather patterns, and the subtle spiritual technologies that made the original practices effective. The shamans possessed understanding of ice crystallization that allowed them to predict exactly how their paintings would weather and change over time, enabling them to create images that would transform in predetermined ways as natural forces acted upon them. The abandonment of ice painting practices coincided with the disruption of traditional Arctic cultures through contact with industrial civilization, but also seems to have been related to environmental changes that altered the types of ice formation that made the practices possible. Modern Arctic conditions affected by global climate patterns that didn't exist when the shamans developed their techniques may no longer provide the specific ice characteristics that these spiritual practices required. Contemporary Arctic peoples still report occasional discoveries of what appear to be traces of ancient ice paintings preserved in permanently frozen areas, images that seem to have been protected from destruction by unique geological conditions that kept them at constant temperatures for decades or possibly centuries. These discoveries are rare and usually accidental, found by hunters or researchers who notice unusual coloration or patterns in ice formations that seem too complex and organized to be natural phenomena. As you stand in this vast white silence, where wind carries the whispers of spirits across ice that remembers every prayer ever painted on its surface, you feel the profound connection between impermanence and the sacred. The ice holds the memory of art that was never meant to last, of prayers that achieved their purpose precisely by dissolving back into the elements that formed them, carrying their messages to realms where winter and summer, creation and destruction, existence and non-existence dance together in the eternal Arctic light. From the world's crown, we journey to its heart, where forests keep their own sacred council. Deep in the Amazon's green cathedral, where sunlight filters through layers of canopy like divine illumination streaming through stained glass windows, you stand among trees that indigenous shamans claimed possessed individual souls, each requiring specific prayers and offerings, each holding within its wooden heart mysteries that connected earthbound roots to star-filled branches. Here, in the world's greatest remaining wilderness, certain tribes developed spiritual practices that saw the forest not as a collection of plants and animals, but as a living congregation of conscious beings engaged in constant communication, with forces that govern the balance between growth and decay, life and transformation. The air around you thrums with the constant symphony of the rainforest, the calls of birds whose songs carry meanings that extend beyond territory and mating, the rustle of leaves that indigenous shamans claimed were actually whispered conversations between trees sharing information about weather patterns, soil conditions, and the spiritual state of the forest as a whole. You move through this green world where every step brings you into contact with plant life that exists in relationships of complexity that modern botany is only beginning to understand, relationships that traditional Amazonian peoples recognized as fundamentally spiritual in nature. The tribes that practiced what anthropologists cautiously termed botanical communion developed over centuries of observation and spiritual experimentation techniques for what they called speaking with the green teachers. These weren't anthropomorphic projections of human consciousness onto plant life, but sophisticated practices based on the indigenous understanding that trees and other forest plants possessed forms of awareness that were different from human, consciousness but equally valid and potentially accessible to human minds that had been properly prepared through ritual purification and expanded through the use of plant teachers like ayahuasca and other consciousness-altering botanicals. Brother Vicente de Carvajal, a Franciscan missionary whose journals from the 16th century provide some of the earliest European documentation of these practices, described encountering tribal shamans who demonstrated what he initially dismissed as elaborate superstition, but was forced to acknowledge as something far more complex and possibly genuine. His writings describe shamans who would approach specific trees and engage in what appeared to be actual conversations, speaking in whispered tones and then remaining silent, as if listening to responses that only they could perceive. The shamans explained to Brother Vicente that trees possessed what they called wooden wisdom, knowledge accumulated over decades or centuries of existence in locations where they could observe all the changes that occurred in their immediate environment. Ancient trees were considered especially valuable teachers because their root systems connected them to extensive underground networks that allowed them to access information from vast areas of the forest, while their height gave them perspectives on weather patterns and seasonal changes that ground-dwelling humans couldn't achieve without technological assistance. The most remarkable aspect of these tree communication practices was their specificity. The shamans had developed detailed taxonomies that identified which species of trees were most knowledgeable about different types of information. Certain hardwood species were consulted for guidance about hunting and food gathering, while others were approached for healing knowledge or information about weather prediction. Some trees were considered specialists in what the shamans called root knowledge, information about underground water sources, mineral deposits, and the hidden movements of earth spirits that influenced soil fertility and plant growth. The protocols for tree communication required extensive preparation that could take weeks or months of spiritual purification. Shamans would fast on specific plant foods, undergo ritual cleansing with sacred plants that prepared their consciousness for non-human forms of communication, and spend extended periods in meditation that aligned their mental rhythms with what they claimed were the much slower thought processes of tree consciousness. The shamans explained that trees experience time differently than humans, thinking and communicating at speeds that matched their slower metabolisms and longer lifespan. During successful tree communications, shamans reported receiving information in forms that were not exactly visual, auditory, or verbal, but combined elements of all these modes of perception in ways that human language couldn't adequately describe. They spoke of trees that would project images directly into their minds, showing them locations of medicinal plants, water sources, or areas where particular animals could be found. Other trees communicated through what the shamans described as root dreams, complex symbolic visions that provided guidance for solving community problems or understanding the spiritual significance of natural events. The shamans developed intricate rituals for thanking trees after successful communications, understanding that the relationship had to be reciprocal to remain effective over time. These Thanksgiving ceremonies involved specific offerings that were believed to nourish not just the physical tree, but its spiritual essence. The offerings included combinations of tobacco, specially prepared plant medicines, and sometimes drops of the shaman's own blood, given in recognition that the tree had shared its accumulated wisdom and deserved compensation for its teaching. Dr. Richard Evans Schultes, the renowned ethnobotanist who spent decades studying Amazonian plant knowledge during the mid-20th century, documented practices that suggested these tree communication techniques produced genuine results that couldn't be explained by coincidence or general forest knowledge. His research notes describe shamans who could locate specific plants in the vast complexity of rainforest vegetation with an accuracy that seemed to exceed what normal observation and experience could account for, finding rare medicinal species. In areas they had never previously visited by following guidance they claimed to have received from tree teachers. The most profound aspect of these practices was the shamans' claim that trees were not individual entities, but were connected through underground root networks and above-ground chemical communications into what they called the green mind, a forest-wide consciousness that could access information from across hundreds of square miles of rainforest. Modern scientific research has begun to validate aspects of this traditional understanding, discovering that trees do indeed communicate through chemical signals and fungal networks that connect root systems across vast distances, sharing information about threats, resources, and environmental changes in ways that create forest-wide information networks. The tree whisperers claimed that by learning to access this green mind, they could receive guidance that came not from individual trees, but from the collective wisdom of entire forest ecosystems. They described this as the deepest level of botanical communion, requiring years of training and spiritual development to achieve, but providing access to forms of ecological knowledge that allowed them to understand and predict environmental changes with remarkable accuracy. The religious significance of these practices extended far beyond practical applications. The shamans viewed their tree communications as forms of prayer and worship that maintained spiritual balance between human communities and the forest ecosystem that sustained them. They believed that trees were intermediaries between earthbound existence and cosmic spiritual forces, their roots connecting to earth energies while their branches reached towards star wisdom, making them natural bridges between different levels of spiritual reality. The most sacred tree communication ceremonies took place during specific seasonal transitions when the shamans believed the boundary between human and plant consciousness became most permeable. These ceremonies involved entire communities and could last for days, with different shamans approaching different trees to gather information that would be compiled into comprehensive guidance for community decisions about hunting, gathering, agriculture, and spiritual practices for the coming season. Colonial disruption and modern deforestation have eliminated most of the tribal communities that maintained these tree communication traditions, but scattered indigenous groups still practice modified versions of the ancient techniques. Contemporary shamans report that environmental destruction has damaged the green mind networks that made the most sophisticated tree communications possible, as the removal of ancient trees and the fragmentation of forest ecosystems has disrupted the root and chemical communication systems that connected trees across large areas. However, in areas where old-growth forest remains intact, indigenous shamans continue to report successful tree communications that provide guidance for modern challenges. They speak of trees that have adapted their teachings to help communities deal with the effects of climate change, environmental contamination, and the loss of traditional forest resources, suggesting that the botanical consciousness they access is capable of evolving and responding to changing circumstances. The tools and techniques developed by tree-whispering shamans included the use of specific plant preparations that enhanced human sensitivity to botanical communications, ritual items made from particular tree species that were believed to facilitate dialogue with tree consciousness, and complex ceremonial protocols that created the proper spiritual conditions for successful plant-human communication. These shamanic technologies represented accumulated knowledge developed over centuries of experimentation and refinement, creating sophisticated methodologies for accessing forms of consciousness that conventional science is only beginning to acknowledge as possible. As you sit quietly against the massive trunk of a Cecropia tree whose age can only be estimated in centuries, feeling the slow pulse of sap moving through wood that has witnessed the rise and fall of countless human generations, you sense the profound silence that fills the spaces between human words and plant consciousness. The forest around you seems to breathe with awareness that extends far beyond individual trees, a green intelligence that observes without judgment and offers wisdom to those who know how to listen with more than human ears. The forest shares its wisdom with those who listen, but the ocean speaks in deeper tongues. Along the ancient coastlines of the Persian Gulf, where the desert meets waters that have cradled civilizations for millennia, there existed a faith as deep and mysterious as the ocean itself. Here, where the sun painted silver paths across morning waves, pearl divers descended not merely in search of treasures, but in pursuit of divine communion with entities they believed dwelt in the submarine temples of the deep. These were not ordinary fishermen seeking fortune in oyster beds. They were devotees of a water-based spirituality so profound that it transformed the simple act of diving into a sacred ritual of communication with aquatic deities. Before each descent, they would perform elaborate purification ceremonies on their boats, washing themselves with seawater mixed with rare salts collected from specific tide pools that they considered sacred springs of the ocean floor. The divers spoke of reaching certain depths where the pressure itself seemed to whisper divine secrets. At these profound levels, they claimed to encounter not mere hallucinations born of oxygen deprivation, but actual visions of underwater temples constructed from living coral and tended by beings of pure aquamarine light. These submarine deities, according to their beliefs, were neither fish nor human, but entities that had chosen the depths as their realm of operation, communicating with mortals through the language of water pressure and the sacred geometry of pearl formation. Each pearl brought to the surface was considered a crystallized message from these aquatic angels. The divers developed an intricate system of interpretation based on the pearl's size, luster, and the specific depth at which it was found. A pearl discovered at 30 fathoms carried different divine significance than one retrieved from 50 fathoms. The color variations within each pearl were read like scripture, with pink hues indicating messages of love and protection, while silver tones suggested warnings or calls to spiritual preparation. The most experienced divers claimed they could sense the presence of these submarine temples even before descending. They described feeling a particular quality of stillness in the water above such sites, as if the ocean itself held its breath in reverence. During their deepest plunges, they reported experiencing a sensation they called liquid prayer, where their own thoughts seemed to dissolve into the surrounding water, allowing direct mind-to-mind communication with the aquatic deities below. These religious practices required years of physical and spiritual preparation. Young initiates spent months learning to hold their breath while meditating, developing not just lung capacity, but what they termed water consciousness, a state of mental clarity that could only be achieved underwater. They practiced diving in shallow lagoons while reciting specific prayers designed to harmonize their heartbeat with the rhythm of the tides. The diving priests maintained detailed records of their underwater visions, though these texts were written in a script that incorporated wave-like patterns and symbols resembling the internal structure of pearls. Modern scholars who have examined fragments of these documents report that the writing system appears to require knowledge of tidal patterns and lunar phases to be properly deciphered, suggesting that even their written language was intrinsically connected to oceanic rhythms. Perhaps most remarkably, these divers claimed that certain pearls could only be retrieved by individuals who had received specific permission from the submarine deities. They spoke of diving to familiar oyster beds only to find them empty, then returning days later, after performing particular rituals, to discover the same beds abundant with pearls. This suggests they viewed their relationship with the ocean not as exploitation, but as a form of sacred partnership requiring constant spiritual negotiation. The theological implications of their beliefs were profound. Unlike surface-dwelling religions that typically viewed the divine as existing above or beyond the physical world, these pearl divers understood their deities as intimately connected to the ocean's depths, accessible through direct physical and spiritual descent into their realm. This wasn't worship from a distance, but immersive communion that required surrendering oneself to an alien environment. Their faith tradition included elaborate funeral rites performed entirely underwater. When a master diver died, his body would be weighted and lowered to specific deep-sea locations they considered gateways to the submarine temples. The deceased was believed to join the aquatic deities as an intermediary, helping to facilitate communication between the living divers and the deeper mysteries of the ocean floor. Archaeological evidence suggests these practices may have been more widespread than previously imagined. Similar pearl diving rituals appear in disconnected coastal cultures from the Red Sea to the South China Sea, all sharing remarkably consistent beliefs about submarine deities and the spiritual significance of pearl formation. This suggests either a common ancient origin for these practices or perhaps something about the deep sea diving experience that naturally leads to similar spiritual revelations. The decline of these practices coincided with the commercialization of pearl diving and the introduction of surface-supplied diving equipment. The religious divers maintained that mechanical breathing apparatus interfered with the spiritual communication that could only occur when one's life force was completely dependent on the breath held within the body, a sacred breath that connected the diver's soul to the cosmic rhythms of the ocean itself. Today, in the museums of coastal cities, you can sometimes find examples of pearls that these religious divers claimed carried divine messages. Museum curators typically focus on their material value and rarity, but if you look closely at their unusual formations and impossible colorations, you might sense echoes of the profound mysteries these ancient practitioners claimed to have discovered. In the crushing darkness of the deep, where pressure transforms carbon into prayer and water becomes the medium through which the divine speaks to those brave enough to descend into its liquid temples. Transition. From ocean depths we surface, to where earth and sky perform their eternal dance. In the Sahara's infinite vastness, where sand dunes shift like the breathing of a sleeping giant and the horizon dissolves into shimmering mirages, there existed a nomadic people whose entire spiritual cosmology centered around objects that fell from heaven. These were the Meteor worshippers, wandering tribes who followed the paths of shooting stars across the desert sky and arranged the fallen stones into complex ceremonial circles that served as earthbound temples for their celestial faith. Their relationship with meteorites transcended simple veneration of unusual objects. To these desert mystics, each fallen star represented a direct message from cosmic intelligences, divine beings who communicated with humanity by literally casting portions of their heavenly realm down to Earth. The arrival of a meteor was never seen as random chance, but as a precisely timed divine intervention carrying specific instructions for those wise enough to interpret the stellar messages. The nomads developed an intricate mythology that portrayed the universe as a vast library, with each star system serving as a repository of divine knowledge. When cosmic events required earthbound intervention, they believed the stellar librarians would select appropriate wisdom fragments and launch them toward Earth as meteors. The impact sites became sacred reading rooms where the faithful could study these fallen texts written in the language of extraterrestrial stone. Their astronomical knowledge was remarkably sophisticated for a nomadic culture. They maintained oral traditions that tracked meteor shower patterns across centuries, predicting not only when such celestial events would occur, but also where the resulting meteorites would most likely fall. Their ability to locate impact sites in the trackless desert suggested they possessed navigation skills that incorporated understanding of celestial mechanics far beyond what their apparent technological level should have allowed. Each meteorite circle they constructed served multiple religious functions. The outer ring typically consisted of iron meteorites believed to provide protection from malevolent cosmic influences. The inner arrangements used stony meteorites organized according to their composition and the celestial conditions under which they fell. Full moon impacts created different sacred geometries than new moon falls, and meteors witnessed during specific planetary alignments required entirely different ceremonial arrangements. The worship ceremonies themselves were timed to cosmic events, with precision that amazed the few European explorers who witnessed them. The nomads would gather at their stone circles during meteor showers, performing rituals that seemed designed to facilitate communication with the falling stars. They claimed that during peak celestial activity, the meteorites in their circles would grow warm to the touch and emit subtle humming sounds that provided direct guidance from their stellar deities. Their oral traditions included detailed catalogues of different types of meteorites and their specific spiritual properties. Pallasites, with their olivine crystals, were considered windows through which earthbound souls could glimpse the cosmic realm. Iron meteorites were viewed as divine tools, capable of focusing spiritual energy in ways that terrestrial metals could not. The rarest finds, carbonaceous chondrites containing organic compounds, were treated as sacred seeds planted by cosmic gardeners to help spiritual evolution take root on Earth. The religious implications of their beliefs challenged conventional understanding of divine revelation. Rather than receiving spiritual guidance through prophets or sacred texts, these meteor worshippers understood divine communication as an ongoing cosmic process, with new revelations literally falling from the sky whenever celestial circumstances required earthbound intervention. Their faith was based not on ancient scriptures, but on constantly updated messages from an active, engaged cosmic intelligence. Their shamanic practices incorporated meditation techniques designed to attune consciousness to meteorite frequencies. Practitioners would lie with their heads resting on specific stones during desert nights, claiming this contact allowed them to receive dreams that were actually communications from the stellar realm. These visions reportedly provided practical guidance for desert survival, as well as profound insights into the nature of cosmic consciousness. The most intriguing aspect of their tradition involved group rituals performed when particularly significant. Meteorites fell. The entire tribe would journey to the impact site and conduct ceremonies they claimed could reopen the stellar doorway, temporarily restoring communication channels between Earth and the specific star system from which the meteorite originated. During these rituals, witnesses reported phenomena that defied explanation: coordinated light displays in the sky, synchronized compass needle movements, and meteorites that seemed to pulse with internal illumination. Their understanding of time itself was influenced by their meteorite worship. They maintained that linear time was an illusion created by earthbound perspective, and that meteorites carried temporal fragments from both the ancient past and distant future of cosmic evolution. By properly interpreting meteorite messages, they claimed to access knowledge of events that had not yet occurred in terrestrial time but had already transpired in stellar time. Archaeological investigations of abandoned meteorite circles reveal construction techniques that suggest these nomads possessed knowledge of magnetic field manipulation. The stones are arranged in patterns that create measurable electromagnetic anomalies, as if the circles were designed to function as terrestrial antennas for receiving cosmic communications. Modern measurements indicate that these arrangements do indeed amplify certain types of electromagnetic signals, though the purpose and origin of this knowledge remains mysterious. The decline of these practices appears to have coincided with increasing European exploration of the Sahara and the subsequent disruption of traditional nomadic routes. Colonial administrators, failing to understand the spiritual significance of meteorite collection, often confiscated unusual stones for European museums, inadvertently dismantling sacred communication networks that had functioned for centuries. Perhaps most remarkably, recent studies of the meteorites collected from these circles reveal isotopic compositions that suggest origins from star systems not yet identified by modern astronomy. If these nomadic people truly possessed the ability to determine meteorite origins through spiritual practice, their cosmic cartography may have been more accurate than our current scientific understanding of stellar geography. In the desert nights, when shooting stars streak across the infinite darkness and impact somewhere in the sand, you might wonder if those ancient messages are still arriving, still carrying divine instructions from cosmic librarians who continue their patient attempts to communicate with a world that has forgotten how to read the language written in fallen stars. Transition. Stars that fall carry messages, but standing stones hold conversations with eternity. Across Britain's mist-shrouded landscapes, where ancient memories lie buried beneath layers of history and legend, there stand circles of stone that hold secrets more mysterious than their construction. These megalithic monuments, scattered from the Scottish Highlands to Cornwall's windswept moors, were reported by countless witnesses throughout history to emit haunting harmonic sounds at sunrise, transforming into acoustic temples that resonated with frequencies that seemed to touch the very soul. The phenomenon was not folklore or romantic imagination. Historical records spanning centuries document these dawn harmonics with remarkable consistency. Medieval chroniclers, Victorian antiquarians, and even modern observers have described the same ethereal experience. As the first rays of sunlight struck the ancient stones, low-frequency sounds would emerge from the megaliths themselves, creating complex harmonic progressions that seemed to induce profound meditative states in those fortunate enough to witness them. The sounds were not simple acoustic tricks produced by wind patterns or thermal expansion. Witnesses consistently described sophisticated musical progressions that changed with the seasons, weather conditions, and lunar phases. During summer solstice sunrises, the stones reportedly produced ascending harmonic series that suggested joy and celebration. Winter solstice dawns brought deeper, more contemplative tones that seemed to acknowledge the season's introspective nature. Celtic Druids apparently understood these acoustic properties and incorporated them into their religious practices. Ancient Irish texts, when carefully translated, contain references to stone teachers that would sing the first wisdom of each day to assembled initiates. These descriptions suggest that the Druids didn't simply build their temples near existing stone circles, but actively sought out locations where the stones exhibited these mysterious harmonic properties. The most detailed historical account comes from a 12th century monk named Brother Aldrich, who spent a year documenting the dawn sounds at a circle in Cumbria. His meticulous records describe how different stones within the circle produced distinct tones that combined to create complex harmonies. He noted that the acoustic patterns followed mathematical relationships similar to those found in sacred music, suggesting that whoever arranged these stones possessed sophisticated understanding of both acoustics and musical theory. Modern acoustic analysis of stone circles has revealed architectural features that seem specifically designed to amplify and modulate sound waves. The placement of stones creates resonance chambers that could theoretically produce the described harmonic effects under specific atmospheric conditions. However, contemporary attempts to reproduce the historical accounts have met with limited success, suggesting that either the stone's properties have changed over time or that additional factors were involved in creating the original phenomena. The religious significance of these singing stones appears to have been profound. Celtic mythology describes the circles as gathering places where earth spirits would communicate with human worshippers through musical language. The dawn harmonics were understood not as mere acoustic curiosities, but as actual conversation between the terrestrial realm and divine intelligences that expressed themselves through stone and sound. Archaeological evidence suggests that many stone circles were acoustically engineered with remarkable precision. The internal geometry of these monuments creates standing wave patterns that amplify specific frequencies while dampening others. This selective acoustic filtering may have been designed to enhance the perception of the subtle harmonic phenomena that witnesses reported experiencing at dawn. The most intriguing aspect of these reports involves the psychological effects described by listeners. Multiple historical accounts describe entering trance-like states while listening to the dawn harmonics, receiving visions or insights that provided guidance for important decisions. Some witnesses reported experiencing what they called stone dreams, vivid mental images that seemed to originate from the megaliths themselves rather than from their own consciousness. Scientific investigation of these meditative effects has revealed that the frequencies described in historical accounts fall within ranges known to influence brainwave patterns. The low-frequency harmonics reportedly produced by the stones could theoretically induce the alpha and theta brainwave states associated with deep meditation and enhanced intuitive awareness. This suggests that the ancient builders may have understood neuroacoustic principles that modern science is only beginning to explore. The tradition of dawn listening apparently required specific preparation and positioning within the circles. Celtic texts describe purification rituals performed before sunrise and precise locations where listeners should stand to receive the full effect of the stone harmonics. These positioning requirements suggest that the acoustic phenomena were highly directional, functioning properly only for those who understood the circle's acoustic geometry. Seasonal variations in the harmonic patterns appear to have corresponded with agricultural and ceremonial calendars. Spring equinox dawns reportedly produced harmonics that encouraged planting activities, while autumn equinox sounds were associated with harvest celebrations. This acoustic calendar system may have served both practical and spiritual functions, providing time-keeping services while reinforcing the community's connection to natural cycles. The decline of these acoustic phenomena seems to have begun during the medieval period, possibly coinciding with climate changes that altered the atmospheric conditions necessary for the effect. Some researchers suggest that the stone's crystalline structure may have been affected by centuries of weathering, reducing their capacity to generate the harmonic resonances that once made them sing. Local folklore traditions preserve echoes of the original acoustic mysteries. Throughout Britain, you can still find folk songs that claim to replicate the melodies once produced by singing stones. These traditional tunes often incorporate unusual modal progressions that don't conform to standard musical scales, possibly preserving fragments of the original stone harmonics in human musical memory. Modern attempts to understand the singing stone phenomenon have employed sophisticated acoustic monitoring equipment, but the results remain frustratingly inconsistent. Occasionally, sensitive instruments do detect subtle, low-frequency emissions from certain megaliths at dawn, but these recordings rarely match the complex harmonic progressions described in historical accounts. Perhaps the most profound mystery involves the question of intentionality. If these stone circles were indeed designed to produce harmonic effects, their builders possessed acoustic engineering knowledge that wouldn't be formally understood till the development of modern wave theory. The precision required to create such effects using Stone Age technology suggests either remarkable empirical understanding or guidance from sources beyond conventional historical explanation. Standing within these ancient circles at dawn, listening to the wind move through the stones and watching the light gradually illuminate their weathered surfaces, you might strain to hear echoes of the harmonics that once transformed these monuments into musical instruments played by the rising sun itself. The stones remain silent now, but perhaps their songs continue in frequencies beyond our current ability to perceive, waiting for consciousness refined enough to once again hear the melodies that turned megalithic circles into temples where earth and sky performed their eternal dawn symphony. Transition. Ancient stones remember their songs, while buried cities dream their forgotten dreams. Beneath the ancient streets of Rome, where the weight of history presses down through layers of civilization built upon civilization, there may exist one of Christianity's most carefully guarded secrets, a hidden basilica where an alternative papal line allegedly continued practicing the original forms of Christian worship that were abandoned when the religion became the official faith of the Roman Empire under Constantine. The story begins in the early 4th century, when Christianity transformed from a persecuted underground movement into the empire's established religion. Historical fragments suggest that not all Christian leaders welcomed this transformation. Some believed that institutional recognition would corrupt the pure spiritual essence of Christ's teachings, diluting divine revelation with political compromise and worldly ambition. According to carefully preserved oral traditions passed down through successive generations of initiates, a group of Roman clergy made a momentous decision during this period of transition. Rather than adapt their practices to meet imperial expectations, they chose to preserve the original Christian mysteries by literally going underground, establishing a secret basilica in the labyrinthine tunnel systems that honeycombed the bedrock beneath Rome. This underground papal line, if it truly existed, would have maintained an unbroken chain of apostolic succession completely separate from the official Vatican hierarchy. Their hidden pope would have been selected not through political maneuvering or ecclesiastical advancement, but through demonstration of the spiritual gifts that the early church considered evidence of divine calling, prophecy, healing, and the ability to facilitate direct mystical communion with the risen Christ. The theological implications of such a parallel church structure are staggering. While the surface church developed elaborate doctrinal frameworks, institutional hierarchies, and political alliances, the underground community apparently preserved the charismatic, mystical practices that characterized Christianity's earliest period. Their liturgies allegedly incorporated elements that were systematically eliminated from official church services: ecstatic worship, prophetic revelation, and communal experiences of divine presence that transcended individual consciousness. Archaeological evidence supporting these claims remains tantalizingly elusive, but certain historical anomalies suggest the possibility of organized Christian activity in Rome's underground systems long after the official church had moved into grand basilicas above ground. Explorers of the Roman catacombs have occasionally discovered chambers that seem too elaborate for simple burial purposes, decorated with Christian symbols that don't conform to officially sanctioned iconography. The most intriguing evidence comes from medieval manuscripts that reference a church of the deep in Rome, describing religious ceremonies conducted in underground chambers lit by perpetual flames that believers claimed were ignited by divine fire rather than ordinary combustion. These texts suggest that the hidden church maintained practices that the surface church had deemed too mystical, too enthusiastic, or too challenging to established ecclesiastical authority. The underground pope's role would have been fundamentally different from that of his surface counterpart. Rather than functioning as a political leader or institutional administrator, he would have served primarily as a mystical facilitator, guiding the community's collective spiritual experiences and maintaining the oral traditions that preserved the original Christian mysteries. His authority would have derived not from formal ordination, but from demonstrated ability to channel divine presence in ways that the early church understood as marks of authentic apostolic ministry. The selection process for this hidden papal succession allegedly involved spiritual rather than political criteria. Candidates would be evaluated based on their capacity for prophetic vision, their effectiveness as healers, and their ability to induce mystical states in other believers. The community would recognize their new leader not through formal election, but through unanimous spiritual discernment that this individual carried the same divine anointing that had characterized Christ's original apostles. The worship practices of this underground church apparently bore little resemblance to the formal liturgies that developed in the surface church. Their services allegedly emphasized spontaneous prophetic utterances, communal healing rituals, and extended periods of mystical contemplation designed to facilitate direct personal encounters with divine presence. They maintained that institutional Christianity had traded the transformative power of authentic spiritual experience for the safety and respectability of regulated religious ceremony. Historical records suggest that knowledge of this hidden church was carefully guarded through coded references in seemingly orthodox texts. Medieval mystics occasionally wrote about seeking the true church beneath Rome, using language that could be interpreted as metaphorical spiritual seeking, but might actually have referred to literal descent into underground religious communities that maintained the original Christian mysteries. The architectural requirements for such a hidden basilica would have been substantial. The underground space would need to accommodate significant numbers of worshippers while remaining completely concealed from surface authorities. It would require ventilation systems, water sources, and acoustic design that would prevent sound from their enthusiastic worship from reaching the streets above. The engineering challenges suggest that if such a facility existed, it was created by individuals with both sophisticated technical knowledge and substantial resources. The theological tension between the surface and underground churches would have centered on fundamental questions about the nature of authentic Christianity. The hidden church apparently maintained that divine revelation was an ongoing process, with contemporary believers capable of receiving direct spiritual guidance that could supplement or even supersede traditional scriptural interpretation. This position would have been incompatible with the developing ecclesiastical structure that emphasized clerical authority and doctrinal consistency. The survival of such a parallel church through the centuries would have required extraordinary dedication and secrecy. Each generation would need to identify and train successors while maintaining complete isolation from the surface Christian community. The psychological and spiritual demands of such underground religious life would have attracted only the most committed believers, those willing to sacrifice normal social existence for the preservation of what they considered authentic spiritual practice. Modern Vatican archives contain occasional references to investigations of irregular religious activities in Rome's underground areas, but these documents typically remain classified or heavily redacted. The official church's historical stance toward mystical movements has generally been cautious, viewing unregulated spiritual experiences as potentially dangerous to ecclesiastical authority and doctrinal purity. Archaeological exploration of Rome's underground systems continues to reveal previously unknown chambers and passages, some containing religious artifacts that don't fit standard patterns of early Christian material culture. While these discoveries don't prove the existence of an underground papal line, they demonstrate that the city's subterranean spaces were more extensively used for religious purposes than previously understood. The ultimate fate of this hidden church, if it existed, remains one of Christianity's most intriguing mysteries. Did it eventually merge back into mainstream Christianity? Did it continue in increasingly small and isolated communities until finally disappearing entirely? Or does it persist even today, maintaining its ancient practices in chambers so deep and secret that even modern Rome remains unaware of the mystical Christianity being practiced beneath its feet? In the quiet moments when you walk through Rome's ancient streets, feeling the weight of history beneath your steps, you might wonder what religious mysteries continue to exist in the darkness below, where the original fire of Christian mysticism might still burn in underground temples that chose eternal hiddenness over temporal respectability. Transition. What Rome buried, Jerusalem preserved in different ways. In the desert caves near the Dead Sea, where ancient silence holds memories more profound than any written history, there may exist manuscripts even more extraordinary than the famous Dead Sea Scrolls already discovered. These are the prophetic texts allegedly created by Essene scribes who claimed to have received visions of a future time when all hidden religious knowledge would be simultaneously revealed to humanity, ending forever the age of spiritual secrets and ushering in an era of universal mystical understanding. The Essenes, that mysterious Jewish sect that withdrew from mainstream religious life to pursue intensive spiritual practice in desert isolation, were known for their prophetic abilities and their careful preservation of esoteric knowledge. But these particular manuscripts, if they truly exist, represent something far beyond their typical theological concerns. They describe what the scribes called the Great Unveiling, a cosmic event that would transform human consciousness and make visible all the spiritual truths that had been hidden throughout history. According to fragmentary references found in authenticated Essene documents, these prophetic manuscripts were created during periods of intense mystical experience when individual scribes claimed to have been transported in vision to future time periods. Unlike typical prophecy that focuses on specific historical events, these texts allegedly describe the fundamental transformation of human awareness itself, detailing how spiritual perception would eventually evolve to make secrecy impossible and revelation universal. The scribes apparently understood this future revelation not as a single dramatic event, but as a gradual expansion of human consciousness that would naturally result in the disclosure of all hidden knowledge. They described seeing visions of a time when the barriers between physical and spiritual perception would dissolve, allowing ordinary individuals to perceive the divine realities that mystics had always struggled to communicate through symbols and metaphors. These prophetic manuscripts allegedly contain detailed descriptions of how different religious traditions would contribute to this universal revelation. The Essene visionaries claim to have seen how Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and other spiritual paths would eventually converge not through theological compromise, but through shared recognition of underlying mystical truths that transcend doctrinal differences. Each tradition would contribute unique insights to a comprehensive understanding of divine reality. The texts reportedly describe specific signs that would herald the approaching age of revelation. These signs would not be dramatic external events, but subtle shifts in human consciousness that would become increasingly apparent as more individuals began experiencing direct, mystical awareness. The scribes predicted that as these consciousness changes accelerated, the artificial boundaries between different religious traditions would become increasingly meaningless. Perhaps most remarkably, these manuscripts allegedly contain instructions for preparing consciousness to receive the coming universal revelation. The Essene prophets apparently understood that the transition from an age of secrecy to an age of revelation would require specific forms of spiritual preparation. They provided detailed practices designed to refine perception and expand awareness in ways that would allow individuals to integrate the overwhelming influx of spiritual knowledge that the Great Unveiling would bring. The prophetic texts reportedly describe how the revelation would affect different aspects of human knowledge. Scientific understanding would be revolutionized as the artificial separation between material and spiritual investigation dissolved. Historical knowledge would be transformed as the true spiritual significance of past events became apparent. Even ordinary human relationships would be affected as people gained the ability to perceive the divine essence present in every individual. The Essene scribes apparently faced a profound dilemma in creating these manuscripts. If they were truly prophesying the end of all spiritual secrecy, how could they justify keeping their own visions hidden? The texts allegedly address this paradox by explaining that certain knowledge must remain concealed until humanity develops sufficient spiritual maturity to integrate revelation without being overwhelmed or corrupted by it. The manuscripts reportedly contain warnings about the challenges that would accompany universal revelation. The scribes predicted that the sudden availability of profound spiritual knowledge would initially cause confusion and conflict as existing religious institutions struggled to adapt to circumstances that would make their traditional gatekeeping roles obsolete. They foresaw a period of spiritual chaos as humanity learned to navigate direct access to divine truth. Archaeological searches for these prophetic manuscripts have been complicated by their alleged location in caves that the Essenes considered so sacred that they were sealed after the texts were deposited. The scribes apparently believed that these particular prophecies were so significant that they should remain hidden until the cosmic conditions they described began to manifest, at which point the manuscripts would be discovered through divine guidance rather than human searching. The theological implications of these texts would be revolutionary if they were ever found and authenticated. They would suggest that the Essenes possessed prophetic abilities that allowed them to perceive the long-term evolution of human spiritual consciousness with remarkable accuracy. More controversially, they would indicate that the age of institutional religion is temporary, destined to be superseded by direct mystical experience available to all humanity. Modern scholars who study Essene theology note that their understanding of prophecy was sophisticated and nuanced. They didn't view the future as predetermined, but as emerging from the interaction between cosmic spiritual forces and human consciousness development. Their prophetic manuscripts would likely reflect this understanding, describing potential futures that could be influenced by humanity's collective spiritual choices. The content of these hidden manuscripts allegedly includes detailed maps of human consciousness evolution, showing how individual spiritual development connects to collective transformation. The Essenes apparently understood that the Great Unveiling would occur when sufficient numbers of individuals achieved the expanded awareness necessary to perceive and integrate universal spiritual truth. The search for these manuscripts continues in the desert caves where Essene communities once flourished. Modern technology has revealed previously unknown chambers in the cliff faces where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, and some researchers believe that the most significant Essene texts may still remain hidden in sealed caves that have never been opened since ancient times. The most intriguing aspect of these prophetic manuscripts involves their relationship to contemporary spiritual phenomena. Some researchers suggest that the consciousness changes the Essenes predicted may already be beginning to manifest in the increasing numbers of individuals reporting direct mystical experiences and the growing recognition that different religious traditions often describe similar spiritual realities using different cultural language. If these manuscripts exist and are eventually discovered, they would provide unprecedented insight into how ancient mystics understood the long-term trajectory of human spiritual evolution. They might reveal that what we consider modern developments in consciousness research and interfaith dialogue were actually foreseen centuries ago by desert visionaries who perceived the cosmic patterns underlying human spiritual development. In the desert silence where Essene communities once waited for divine revelation, the search continues for texts that may contain the most extraordinary prophecy ever recorded, the prediction that humanity would eventually outgrow the need for spiritual secrets and enter an age where divine truth would be as visible as the desert sun, illuminating every corner of human consciousness with the light of universal mystical understanding. Transition. Prophecies speak of revelation, while lost gospels whisper of forgotten truths. In the hidden monasteries of Egypt's desert wastes, where early Christian mystics sought divine truth through contemplation and ascetic practice, there existed collections of Gnostic writings that transcended the boundaries of traditional religious literature. These were not merely theological treatises or spiritual guidance texts, but detailed cartographic documents that claimed to map alternate dimensions where different versions of religious history had unfolded, complete with precise descriptions of parallel spiritual realities accessible through advanced mystical practice. These extraordinary manuscripts, fragments of which occasionally surface in academic circles before disappearing again into private collections, presented a cosmology that challenged every assumption about the nature of spiritual reality. According to these texts, our familiar religious narratives, the stories of prophets, saviors, and divine revelations that form the foundation of world religions, represent only one possible version of cosmic spiritual development among infinite variations playing out simultaneously across dimensional boundaries. The Gnostic authors apparently possessed a sophisticated understanding of what contemporary theorists might recognize as parallel universe concepts. They describe techniques for shifting consciousness between different dimensional layers of reality, each containing its own version of spiritual history, with unique prophets, different sacred texts, and alternative outcomes for humanity's relationship with the divine. These weren't metaphorical descriptions, but practical instruction manuals for interdimensional mystical exploration. One fragmentary text describes a reality where Christianity developed as a primarily mystical tradition from its inception, never becoming institutionalized or politically established. In this alternate spiritual timeline, Jesus remained a teacher of direct divine experience rather than becoming the central figure of organized religion. The communities that followed his teachings maintained their focus on inner transformation and mystical communion, creating a completely different trajectory for Western spirituality. Another manuscript details dimensions where Buddhism and Hinduism merged into a unified tradition thousands of years before their historical separation, resulting in spiritual practices that combined meditation techniques with devotional approaches in ways that our reality never explored. The text provides specific meditation instructions that allegedly allow practitioners to access the consciousness states achieved by masters in these alternate spiritual dimensions. The most remarkable aspect of these Gnostic writings was their claim that advanced practitioners could not only perceive these alternate spiritual realities, but actually interact with them. The texts describe methods for what they call dimensional ministry, where mystics from our reality could provide guidance and assistance to spiritual seekers in parallel dimensions, just as beings from other realities occasionally offered help to mystics in our world. The theological implications of these multidimensional maps were staggering. If multiple versions of spiritual reality existed simultaneously, then questions of religious truth became infinitely more complex. The Gnostic authors suggested that no single religious tradition contained complete truth because truth itself existed in countless variations across dimensional boundaries. True spiritual enlightenment required not just mastery of one's own reality's spiritual possibilities, but awareness of the infinite spectrum of divine expression across all possible worlds. These manuscripts allegedly contained detailed protocols for what they termed cross-dimensional spiritual research. Practitioners could supposedly study how specific spiritual principles manifested differently across various realities, gaining a comprehensive understanding of divine law that transcended the limitations of single-dimension religious experience. This research required years of preparation and carried significant risks, as consciousness could potentially become lost between dimensions if proper anchoring techniques weren't maintained. The texts describe collaborative projects between mystics across different dimensional versions of Earth, working together to solve spiritual problems that affected multiple realities simultaneously. They speak of cosmic spiritual challenges that required coordinated responses from enlightened beings across many dimensions, suggesting that advanced mystical work naturally transcends the boundaries of individual realities. Perhaps most intriguingly, these Gnostic manuscripts claimed that certain individuals existed simultaneously across multiple dimensions, serving as bridges between different versions of spiritual reality. These multidimensional beings allegedly retained memories of their experiences in various realities, allowing them to synthesize wisdom from countless spiritual traditions that existed only in alternate dimensions. The practical instructions contained in these texts were extraordinarily detailed. They described specific breathing techniques, visualization practices, and consciousness-altering substances that could facilitate dimensional shifting. The manuscripts included warnings about the psychological dangers of such practices, noting that unprepared minds could be overwhelmed by exposure to radically different versions of reality, where familiar spiritual concepts functioned according to completely different principles. The monastic communities that preserved these texts apparently established entire curricula around multidimensional mystical training. Students would spend years learning to stabilize their consciousness within their home dimension before attempting any cross-dimensional exploration. Advanced practitioners served as guides, helping less experienced mystics navigate the disorienting experience of encountering familiar spiritual figures who had developed along completely different evolutionary paths. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Egyptian monasteries contained chambers specifically designed for these interdimensional practices. These spaces incorporated geometric patterns and acoustic properties that allegedly facilitated consciousness shifting between realities. Modern analysis of these chambers reveals architectural features that create unusual electromagnetic fields and subsonic resonances, though their connection to the mystical practices described in the texts remains speculative. The decline of these multidimensional Gnostic traditions appears to have coincided with increasing Orthodox Christian influence in Egyptian monasticism. Church authorities viewed the concepts described in these texts as dangerously heretical, not merely because they challenged Christian doctrine, but because they suggested that Christian truth itself was only one variation among infinite possibilities, undermining the exclusive claims that institutional Christianity required for its authority. The suppression of these manuscripts was apparently systematic and thorough. Most copies were destroyed, though rumors persist that complete collections remain hidden in sealed chambers beneath certain Egyptian monasteries. The few fragments that survived were often disguised as conventional mystical texts, with their multi-dimensional content encoded in symbolic language that could only be understood by initiates familiar with the interdimensional mapping techniques. Modern theoretical physics has developed concepts that bear striking resemblances to the cosmological models described in these ancient Gnostic texts. Quantum mechanical theories about parallel universes and string theory. Descriptions of multiple dimensions echo the sophisticated understanding of reality's multidimensional nature that these desert mystics apparently possessed through direct, mystical experience rather than mathematical calculation. The ultimate mystery surrounding these texts involves the question of their source. How did ancient mystics, working with meditative techniques and ascetic practices, develop understanding of multidimensional reality that parallels cutting-edge theoretical physics? Either they possessed intuitive access to cosmic principles that science is only beginning to discover, or they actually succeeded in their claimed ability to explore alternate dimensions where different versions of spiritual and physical reality provided them with knowledge unavailable within the confines of our single-dimensional experience. In the desert monasteries where these extraordinary manuscripts were once studied, the silence now holds memories of mystics who claimed to have walked between worlds, mapping territories of consciousness that most spiritual traditions never imagined existed. Perhaps somewhere in hidden chambers, complete copies of these interdimensional cartographic texts still wait to reveal the infinite variations of divine truth that play out across the boundless spectrum of possible realities. Transition. Multiple realities weave together like threads in a tapestry that spans continents. Along the ancient trade routes that connected east and west, where merchants carried more than silk and spices across vast distances, there arose religious sanctuaries unlike any the world had seen before or since. These were the syncretic temples of the Silk Road, extraordinary spiritual laboratories where Buddhist meditation techniques merged with Christian mysticism, where Islamic geometric prayer forms blended with Zoroastrian fire ceremonies, and where the boundaries between different religious traditions dissolved entirely in pursuit of universal spiritual truth. These temples were not the result of cultural confusion or religious compromise. They represented sophisticated theological experiments conducted by spiritually advanced practitioners who recognized that the diverse religious traditions emerging across Eurasia were expressing the same fundamental divine realities through different cultural languages. Rather than viewing religious differences as obstacles to spiritual unity, these Silk Road mystics saw them as complementary approaches to understanding the infinite nature of divine truth. The architectural design of these syncretic temples reflected their theological sophistication. A typical sanctuary might feature a Buddhist meditation hall oriented according to Islamic geometric principles, with Christian symbolic artwork incorporated into Zoroastrian fire altar arrangements. These weren't random combinations of religious elements, but carefully considered integrations based on deep understanding of how different spiritual practices could enhance and illuminate each other. The daily religious life within these temples followed rhythms that honored multiple traditions simultaneously. Morning prayers might begin with Zoroastrian fire ceremonies to welcome the dawn, continue with Islamic devotional practices during the day's heat, incorporate Buddhist meditation sessions in the afternoon, and conclude with Christian contemplative prayer as evening approached. Rather than creating spiritual confusion, this integrated approach apparently produced profound mystical experiences that transcended what any single tradition could achieve alone. The theological framework underlying these syncretic practices was remarkably sophisticated. The temple communities developed comprehensive mapping systems that identified corresponding concepts across different religious traditions. They understood that Buddhist compassion, Christian love, Islamic mercy, and Zoroastrian good thoughts were culturally specific expressions of the same fundamental divine quality. This recognition allowed them to combine practices from different traditions in ways that amplified, rather than diluted, their spiritual effectiveness. Perhaps most remarkably, these communities developed entirely new spiritual practices that existed nowhere within the individual traditions they drew from. They created meditation techniques that incorporated Islamic prayer postures with Buddhist breath awareness, Christian contemplative focusing with Zoroastrian light visualization, and devotional practices that simultaneously honored multiple expressions of divine reality without creating theological conflict. The communities that maintained these temples attracted spiritual seekers from across the known world. Traveling merchants often extended their journeys specifically to spend time in these unique religious environments where they could explore spiritual practices unavailable in their home cultures. The temples served as universities of comparative mysticism, where practitioners could study the essential techniques from multiple traditions under the guidance of masters who had achieved integration across religious boundaries. The selection and training of temple leadership required unprecedented qualifications. A spiritual director needed to demonstrate not merely expertise in one religious tradition, but authentic realization within multiple paths. These individuals had typically spent years studying with Buddhist masters, Christian desert fathers, Islamic mystics, and Zoroastrian priests, developing the rare capacity to facilitate spiritual practices that honored the depths of each tradition while transcending their surface differences. The worship services in these temples created experiences that participants described as touching the universal essence underlying all religious expression. Ceremonies might begin with Zoroastrian light invocations, incorporate Islamic geometric movement patterns, include periods of Buddhist mindfulness meditation, and conclude with Christian contemplative communion, all flowing together as unified spiritual experience rather than disconnected religious activities. The theological writings produced by these communities represented some of the most sophisticated comparative religious thinking in human history. They developed comprehensive theories about the relationship between cultural expression and universal spiritual truth, explaining how divine reality necessarily manifests through diverse cultural forms while remaining essentially unified at its deepest level. These theological frameworks provided intellectual foundations for practices that might otherwise have seemed like spiritual eclecticism. The decline of these syncretic temples began as political boundaries hardened and religious authorities from various traditions began viewing theological integration as threatening to their institutional authority. As trade routes became increasingly controlled by specific political entities, the cosmopolitan spiritual experimentation that had flourished in the cultural crossroads of the Silk Road became difficult to sustain. The suppression of these communities often occurred through indirect pressure rather than direct persecution. Religious authorities would discourage their followers from visiting or supporting temples that practiced impure versions of their traditions. Political leaders would restrict the movements of traveling mystics who facilitated the cross-cultural spiritual exchanges that the syncretic communities required for their continued development. Archaeological evidence of these temples is often difficult to identify because their architectural integration of multiple religious traditions can be mistaken for cultural confusion rather than recognized as sophisticated theological experimentation. Artifacts that combine symbols from different religious traditions are typically interpreted as evidence of religious syncretism in the negative sense, rather than as remains of advanced spiritual communities that had transcended conventional religious boundaries. The most intriguing aspect of these Silk Road temples involves their apparent success in creating genuine spiritual unity across religious differences. Historical accounts suggest that practitioners who trained in these communities achieved mystical states that transcended the limitations of their original religious backgrounds, accessing universal spiritual experiences that remained consistent, regardless of the specific cultural practices used to facilitate them. Modern interfaith dialogue movements often struggle with questions that these ancient Silk Road communities apparently resolved through direct spiritual experimentation. They're practical demonstrations that different religious traditions could be integrated without losing their essential spiritual effectiveness, provide historical evidence that universal spiritual truth can be approached through multiple cultural pathways simultaneously. The ultimate fate of the theological knowledge developed by these syncretic communities remains one of the Silk Road's greatest mysteries. Did their integration techniques survive in hidden forms within established religious traditions? Were their universal spiritual practices preserved by secret lineages that continued to transmit them across generations? Or did their sophisticated understanding of how to transcend religious boundaries while honoring religious depths disappear entirely when political and ecclesiastical pressures made such theological experimentation impossible? In the ancient cities where these extraordinary temples once flourished, modern visitors might pause to imagine what spiritual possibilities were explored by communities that refused to accept that divine truth was limited by cultural boundaries, creating sacred spaces where the universal essence of all religious traditions could be experienced directly through practices that honored the depths of every path while transcending the limitations of any single approach to the infinite mystery of divine reality. Transition. Where trade routes crossed, faiths danced together before time taught them to stand apart. In the jade-green depths of Guatemala's jungle temples, where ancient stone pyramids rise like mathematical prayers toward the celestial vault, there existed a priestly class whose spiritual practices transcended the boundaries between religion and science in ways that modern understanding struggles to comprehend. These were the Mayan cosmic mathematicians, priest scholars who developed numerical formulas they claimed could predict the precise mechanisms through which divine forces would intervene in human affairs. These were not conventional astrological calculations based on planetary movements and celestial cycles. The Mayan priest mathematicians apparently discovered mathematical relationships that described the actual operational principles governing divine intervention itself. Their equations allegedly quantified the cosmic conditions under which spiritual forces would manifest in physical reality, providing predictive frameworks for when and how the gods would directly interact with earthly events. The complexity of their mathematical theology far exceeded their civilization's general mathematical knowledge. While Mayan culture is known for sophisticated calendrical calculations and architectural geometry, the divine equations developed by their highest-ranking priests incorporated mathematical concepts that weren't formally recognized by Western mathematics until centuries later. They worked with numerical relationships that seemed to anticipate developments in chaos theory, fractal mathematics, and quantum probability calculations. The source of this advanced mathematical knowledge remains one of archaeology's most perplexing mysteries. The priest mathematicians claimed their equations were revealed through direct communication with cosmic intelligences during extended ritual ceremonies that combined mathematical meditation with psychoactive plant sacraments. They maintained that the numerical relationships governing divine intervention could only be perceived by consciousness that had been specifically prepared through rigorous spiritual and mathematical training. Their temple complexes were designed as three-dimensional mathematical instruments with architectural proportions that allegedly amplified the priest's ability to perceive the cosmic numerical patterns underlying divine activity. The positioning of altars, the angles of ceremonial staircases, and the acoustics of ritual chambers were all calculated according to the divine equations, creating environments where mathematical contemplation became a form of religious worship. The practical applications of their divine mathematics were remarkably specific. The priests claimed they could calculate the exact timing for when divine intervention would be most effective for specific purposes: healing ceremonies, agricultural decisions, warfare planning, and community problem-solving. Their mathematical predictions apparently achieved accuracy rates that impressed even Spanish conquistadors who documented the priests' abilities while simultaneously condemning them as diabolic. The theological implications of mathematically predictable divine intervention challenged conventional understanding of both mathematics and religion. If divine activity followed mathematical laws that could be calculated and predicted, what did this suggest about the nature of free will, divine spontaneity, and the relationship between spiritual and physical reality? The Mayan priest mathematicians developed sophisticated theological frameworks to address these questions. They understood divine intervention not as arbitrary supernatural events, but as natural expressions of cosmic mathematical principles that operated at levels beyond ordinary perception. Their equations describe the conditions under which these higher-order mathematical relationships would manifest in ways that appeared miraculous to those who couldn't perceive the underlying numerical patterns governing reality's deepest structures. The training required to master these divine equations was extraordinarily demanding. Student priests spent years developing mathematical intuition through contemplative practices that combine numerical meditation with consciousness-altering disciplines. They learned to perceive mathematical relationships directly through mystical experience rather than through analytical calculation, developing what they called sacred arithmetic that functioned as both spiritual practice and scientific investigation. The most advanced practitioners claimed they could perceive the mathematical structures underlying different types of divine intervention. Healing miracles followed different numerical patterns than agricultural blessings, which operated according to different equations than military victories or diplomatic successes. Each category of divine activity required specific mathematical preparation and precise timing calculations to achieve optimal effectiveness. Their record-keeping systems preserved detailed documentation of their predictive successes and failures, creating databases that allowed them to refine their equations across generations. These mathematical theological archives allegedly contained centuries of accumulated data about the relationship between calculated cosmic conditions and observed divine interventions, providing empirical foundations for their extraordinary claims about the mathematical nature of spiritual reality. The Spanish conquest devastated these mathematical mystical traditions not only through direct persecution, but through the destruction of the codices that contained their accumulated divine equations. The few surviving fragments suggest mathematical sophistication that modern scholars find difficult to explain, incorporating numerical concepts that seem to anticipate mathematical developments that wouldn't occur in European mathematics for centuries. Modern archaeoastronomy has revealed that Mayan architectural sites incorporate mathematical relationships that create measurable effects on electromagnetic fields, subsonic resonances, and even localized gravitational anomalies. These discoveries suggest that the priest mathematicians' claims about their temples functioning as mathematical instruments may have had basis in physical reality, even if the mechanisms they described in spiritual terms are better understood. Today, in scientific language, the psychological effects reported by Spanish observers who witnessed Mayan mathematical religious ceremonies included altered states of consciousness that seemed to correlate with the numerical calculations being performed. This suggests that the divine equations may have incorporated understanding of how mathematical contemplation could induce specific neurological states that enhanced perception of subtle environmental patterns. Perhaps most intriguingly, some researchers have identified mathematical relationships in the surviving Mayan equation fragments that parallel formulas used in contemporary chaos theory and complex systems analysis. If these parallels are more than coincidental, they suggest that Mayan priest mathematicians may have developed mathematical tools for understanding complex systems behavior centuries before such concepts emerged in modern science. The ultimate mystery surrounding the Mayan divine equations involves their claimed predictive accuracy for events that seem to transcend normal causality. If their mathematical formulas could truly predict divine intervention, they possessed understanding of reality's operational principles that transcends both conventional religious thought and contemporary scientific knowledge. Either their claims were elaborate delusions, or they had discovered mathematical principles governing the relationship between consciousness, intention, and physical manifestation that modern understanding has yet to recognize. The search for surviving copies of complete divine equation systems continues in the remote areas where Mayan communities maintained their mathematical mystical traditions long after the conquest. Indigenous shamans occasionally reference numerical practices inherited from their priest-mathematician ancestors, though the full theological and mathematical frameworks that once supported these practices appear to have been lost with the destruction of the temple schools where they were developed and transmitted. In the jungle temples where these extraordinary mathematical mystics once calculated the timing of divine intervention, modern visitors might pause to contemplate the profound question. Their work raises about the relationship between mathematical understanding and spiritual reality. If consciousness and cosmic forces operate according to mathematical principles that can be calculated and predicted, then the boundaries between science and spirituality may be far more permeable than either modern religion or contemporary science. Typically acknowledges transition. Numbers that described God's movements also measured time in ways we still don't comprehend. Across the vast Pacific Ocean, where endless blue expanses stretch beyond every horizon and land exists only as distant memory or distant hope, there sailed navigators whose wayfinding abilities transcended the boundaries of conventional maritime knowledge. These were the Polynesian spiritual navigators, master seafarers who claimed their extraordinary ability to cross thousands of miles of open ocean without instruments derived not from accumulated maritime experience, but from direct communication with oceanic spiritual entities who served as divine guides across the pathless waters. These navigators were not simply skilled seamen who used religious rituals to enhance their confidence during dangerous voyages. They were practitioners of a sophisticated spiritual technology that transformed ocean travel into mystical communion with intelligent forces that existed within and beyond the physical waters. Their relationship with the sea was fundamentally different from that of ordinary sailors. They understood the ocean not as an obstacle to be overcome, but as a conscious entity capable of providing direct guidance to those who knew how to establish proper spiritual communication. The preparation required for divine navigation was extraordinarily rigorous, involving years of training that combined practical seamanship with intensive spiritual discipline. Student navigators learned to perceive subtle environmental signs that indicated the presence and intentions of oceanic spirits, specific wave patterns that suggested divine approval or warning, cloud formations that revealed spiritual communication, and changes in water color or temperature that indicated proximity to sacred sea routes known only to the oceanic entities. The most remarkable aspect of their practice involved what they called water consciousness, a mystical state achieved through extended meditation while floating in deep ocean waters. During these sessions, navigators claimed to merge their awareness with the consciousness of the sea itself, gaining access to knowledge that existed beyond individual human perception. In this expanded state, they could allegedly perceive the location of distant islands, the approach of weather systems days in advance, and the safest routes through dangerous currents or reef systems. their oral traditions preserved detailed accounts of specific oceanic spirits who served as navigational guides. These were not vague mythological entities, but precisely characterized beings with distinct personalities, territorial ranges, and preferred methods of communication. Different spirits guided different types of voyages. Some specialized in inter-island trading routes, others assisted in long-distance exploration expeditions, and still others provided guidance during emergency situations when conventional navigation techniques had failed. The communication protocols with these oceanic spirits were highly sophisticated, involving specific offerings, prayers, and behavioral codes that navigators had to maintain throughout their voyages. The spirits apparently required evidence of the navigator's spiritual purity and genuine need for guidance before providing assistance. Violations of these spiritual protocols could result in the withdrawal of divine navigation support, leaving the vessel to rely on conventional seamanship techniques that were often inadequate for Pacific distances. The accuracy of their spiritual navigation techniques astonished European explorers who witnessed them. Polynesian navigators could predict the location of islands they had never visited, accurately forecast weather patterns days in advance, and guide their vessels through complex reef systems in complete darkness. Their success rates for long distance ocean voyages far exceeded what should have been possible using the navigation techniques that Europeans understood. The theological implications of their practices were profound. The navigators understood the ocean not as empty space to be crossed, but as a living spiritual environment populated by intelligent entities who could provide direct assistance to humans who approached them with proper respect and preparation. This transformed every voyage into a spiritual pilgrimage requiring continuous divine cooperation for successful completion. Their vessels were consecrated as floating temples, with specific areas designated for spiritual practices necessary to maintain communication with oceanic guides. The construction of navigation canoes incorporated ritual elements designed to make the boats acceptable to the spiritual entities whose assistance would be required during the voyage. Even the selection and preparation of crew members involved spiritual considerations, as the presence of individuals lacking proper spiritual preparation could interfere with divine communication. The navigation techniques themselves were inseparable from religious practice. Rote-finding decisions were made through divination methods that involved consulting the oceanic spirits about optimal courses, timing, and conditions. The navigators maintained that attempting to cross Pacific distances using purely rational navigation methods was not only ineffective, but spiritually dangerous, as it demonstrated lack of proper respect for the oceanic entities whose domain they were entering. The most extraordinary accounts describe navigational assistance that seemed to transcend normal physical limitations. Navigators reported being guided by phosphorescent lights that appeared in the water ahead of their vessels, leading them towards safe harbors during storms or dangerous conditions. Others described receiving direct telepathic guidance about course corrections, wind changes, or the proximity of land, information that proved accurate even when it contradicted visible environmental evidence. The decline of these spiritual navigation traditions began with European colonization and the introduction of mechanical navigation instruments. Colonial authorities viewed the navigators' claims about oceanic spirits as primitive superstition, failing to recognize the sophisticated spiritual technology that had enabled Polynesian cultures to successfully colonize islands across the world's largest ocean thousands of years before European maritime technology made such voyages possible. The suppression of these practices wasn't achieved through direct prohibition, but through cultural changes that undermined the social and spiritual contexts necessary for divine navigation training. As traditional Polynesian societies were disrupted by colonization, the extended apprenticeship systems and community support structures that had sustained the navigator traditions gradually disappeared. Modern attempts to understand Polynesian Navigation techniques have focused on identifying the environmental cues and pattern recognition skills that enabled their remarkable accuracy. While this research has revealed sophisticated traditional knowledge about ocean conditions, weather patterns, and celestial navigation, it fails to account for the aspects of their abilities that seem to transcend normal sensory information. Processing. Archaeological evidence suggests that the spiritual navigation traditions may have been more widespread than previously recognized. Similar practices appear to have existed among other Pacific Island cultures, Native American coastal peoples, and even some Atlantic maritime communities, suggesting that divine navigation may represent a universal human capacity that was developed to high levels by cultures whose survival depended on ocean travel. The most intriguing modern developments involve contemporary Polynesian navigators who have attempted to revive traditional spiritual practices alongside conventional seamanship techniques. Some report experiencing phenomena that echo the accounts of their ancestors: unusual environmental awareness during ocean voyages, intuitive knowledge about weather and sea conditions, and occasional experiences that suggest communication with non-physical oceanic intelligences. The ultimate mystery of Polynesian divine navigation involves the question of whether their oceanic spirits were actual, non-physical entities, sophisticated personifications of environmental pattern recognition, or something that transcends both possibilities. If their claims about spiritual communication were accurate, they possessed access to forms of knowledge and guidance that challenge conventional understanding of both maritime navigation and the nature of consciousness itself. In the endless expanses of the Pacific, where Polynesian navigators once sailed guided by divine compass readings that transcended physical instruments, modern sailors might pause to consider whether the ocean holds forms of intelligence and guidance that scientific navigation has forgotten how to perceive. Wisdom that flows beneath the waves for those who remember how to establish spiritual communication with the vast consciousness that moves within the world's waters. Transition. Ocean spirits guided voyages across waters, while desert spirits taught different lessons in vast emptiness. In the ancient cities of Turkey, where East meets West in architectural splendor and spiritual convergence, there once existed communities of Sufi mystics whose whirling meditation practices achieved states of consciousness so profound that witnesses reported the dancers seemed to partially disappear from physical reality, becoming translucent figures who existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions before returning to full material presence as their sacred spinning gradually ceased. These were not the familiar Sufi whirling ceremonies that continue today as cultural performances or conventional spiritual practices. These were advanced mystical techniques developed by orders of dervishes who had discovered that specific combinations of movement, breath, and divine invocation could shift human consciousness between different planes of existence, allowing practitioners to experience direct communion with spiritual realities that normally remained invisible to earthbound perception. The historical accounts of these extraordinary practices come from multiple sources, including Islamic scholars who documented them with mixture of fascination and theological concern, Christian observers who witnessed performances during diplomatic visits, and even Ottoman court records that describe official investigations into the phenomenon. The consistency of these reports across different cultural perspectives suggests that something genuinely unusual was occurring during these advanced whirling sessions. The preparation required for interdimensional whirling was extraordinarily intensive, involving years of physical conditioning, spiritual purification, and consciousness training that went far beyond conventional Sufi practices. Students learned not only the physical techniques of sacred spinning, but also the mental disciplines necessary to maintain awareness while shifting between dimensional states and the spiritual protections required to navigate non-physical realities safely. The theological framework underlying these practices was sophisticated and controversial. The mystics understood that divine reality existed across multiple levels of manifestation, from the dense physical plane to increasingly subtle spiritual dimensions. They believed that through proper technique and divine grace, human consciousness could temporarily access these higher dimensional levels, gaining direct experience of spiritual truths that could only be inadequately described through conventional religious language. The whirling techniques themselves incorporated mathematical principles that governed the relationship between physical movement and consciousness alteration. The dancers spun at specific speeds, following precisely calculated patterns that created particular effects on brainwave patterns, vestibular system function, and what they described as the subtle energy systems that connected physical and spiritual aspects of human existence. Witnesses consistently described visual phenomena that accompanied the advanced whirling practices. As dancers achieved deeper states of mystical absorption, their physical forms reportedly became increasingly transparent, as if their material density was literally decreasing. Some observers claimed to see luminous geometric patterns surrounding the whirling figures, while others reported perceiving the dancers' forms multiplied across slightly different positions, as if single individuals were existing in several dimensional locations simultaneously. The dancers' own accounts of their experiences during these interdimensional sessions described accessing realities where conventional physical laws operated differently. They spoke of encountering spiritual beings who existed primarily in non-physical dimensions, receiving teachings about the nature of divine reality that transcended what could be understood through ordinary consciousness, and gaining direct perception of the cosmic principles underlying material manifestation. The most advanced practitioners claimed they could consciously control their dimensional shifting, choosing to project their awareness into specific spiritual planes while maintaining enough physical connection to safely return to normal consciousness. These masters served as guides for less experienced dancers, helping to anchor their consciousness during the disorienting transition periods when awareness existed partially in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The communities that preserved these practices developed sophisticated support systems for managing the psychological and spiritual challenges associated with interdimensional experience. They understood that consciousness unprepared for exposure to non-physical realities could be overwhelmed or permanently damaged by the experience. Extensive protocols existed for recognizing and treating various forms of dimensional displacement syndrome that could affect practitioners who attempted advanced techniques without adequate preparation. The musical accompaniment for these sessions was specifically composed to facilitate dimensional shifting. The rhythms, melodies, and harmonic progressions were based on mathematical relationships that allegedly resonated with the vibrational frequencies of different spiritual planes. Musicians who provided this support were themselves trained mystics who understood how sound could be used to guide consciousness through interdimensional transitions. The decline of these practices began during periods of Islamic Orthodox revival, when religious authorities became increasingly concerned about mystical techniques that seemed to transcend conventional theological boundaries. The idea that human consciousness could directly access divine realities without clerical mediation was viewed as potentially threatening to established religious authority structures. The suppression occurred gradually through increased scrutiny of Sufi communities, restrictions on public whirling performances, and theological pressure to conform mystical practices to more conventional Islamic norms. The advanced techniques were eventually practiced only in secret, with knowledge transmitted through carefully selected lineages of initiates who understood the political dangers associated with their extraordinary abilities. Modern neuroscience has identified mechanisms through which the type of prolonged spinning practiced by Sufi mystics could theoretically produce the altered states of consciousness described in historical accounts. The combination of vestibular system disruption, rhythmic movement, controlled breathing, and focused attention could create neurological conditions that might generate experiences of dimensional shifting, though this scientific explanation doesn't address the consistent reports of visible transparency and other phenomena observed by witnesses. Contemporary attempts to revive these advanced whirling techniques have met with limited success, partly because the complete spiritual and technical training systems that supported them were largely destroyed during their suppression. Modern practitioners often achieve profound meditative states through whirling, but the specific interdimensional effects described in historical accounts remain elusive. The theological questions raised by these practices continue to challenge both Islamic scholarship and broader understanding of mystical experience. If Sufi mystics truly achieved the ability to shift consciousness between dimensions, their practices represented forms of spiritual technology that transcended conventional religious categories, suggesting that divine reality might be far more accessible to direct human experience than most theological systems acknowledge. Archaeological investigation of the spaces where these advanced whirling practices occurred has revealed architectural features that may have been designed to enhance the interdimensional effects. Some Sufi lodge buildings contain chambers with acoustic properties and geometric proportions that create unusual resonance patterns, possibly serving as technological support for consciousness-altering practices that combined spiritual technique with environmental engineering. The most profound mystery surrounding these interdimensional Sufi practices involves their apparent success in achieving the mystical goals that all spiritual traditions aspire toward: direct experience of divine reality transcending the limitations of ordinary consciousness. If their techniques truly enabled practitioners to perceive and interact with spiritual dimensions normally hidden from human awareness, they possessed spiritual technology that represents one of humanity's most extraordinary achievements in the exploration of consciousness and divine reality. In the ancient halls where Sufi mystics once whirled between dimensions, spinning themselves into states of consciousness that transcended the boundaries of ordinary perception, modern visitors might pause to contemplate the profound possibilities for human spiritual development that may have been demonstrated by dancers who discovered that the distance between physical and spiritual reality might be no greater than the space between one whirling step and the next. Transition. Spinning opens doorways that walking cannot find, while stillness reveals what movement obscures. In the remote monasteries of Mount Athos, where morning mist clings to ancient stone like prayers half-whispered, you discover a mystery that challenges everything we think we know about art, faith, and the nature of divine inspiration itself. Here, among manuscripts yellowed with age and incense-soaked chambers, lie accounts that speak of Orthodox monks who claimed something extraordinary. They painted icons not with earthly pigments, but with light itself. Brother Theophanes, writing in the 14th century, described witnessing his elder, Father Maximos, prepare for what he called the sacred painting. The old monk would fast for 40 days, praying continuously in a cell lit only by a single oil lamp. When the time came, witnesses reported that Father Maximos would extend his hands toward a prepared wooden panel, and streams of golden radiance would flow from his fingertips like liquid sunlight, forming the features of Christ, the Virgin, or the saints with perfect precision. These weren't metaphorical descriptions born of religious fervor. Multiple independent accounts from different monasteries across the Eastern Orthodox world describe the same phenomenon. The icons created through this mysterious process possessed qualities that defied natural explanation. They glowed with their own inner light, requiring no external illumination to be clearly visible even in complete darkness. More remarkably, witnesses reported that these luminous icons would change their appearance based on the spiritual state of the person viewing them. A sinner approaching such an icon might see the painted face bearing an expression of gentle correction, while a penitent soul would perceive infinite compassion in the same features. Some accounts describe the painted eyes following viewers as they moved, not in the conventional artistic sense, but as if actual divine consciousness inhabited the illuminated image. The process of creating these light paintings was apparently so demanding that only the most spiritually advanced monks could attempt it. Father Sergius of Radonej, writing in the 15th century, described the physical toll it took on the painters. After completing a light icon, the monk would often remain in a trance-like state for days, speaking only in tongues and requiring constant care from his brothers. Some never fully returned to ordinary consciousness, remaining in a perpetual state of mystical ecstasy until their deaths. What made these accounts particularly intriguing was their consistency across geographical and temporal boundaries. Orthodox monasteries in Russia, Greece, Bulgaria, and Serbia all preserved similar traditions, yet there was no evidence of communication between these communities that could explain the uniform nature of the phenomenon. Each tradition claimed to have received the knowledge directly through divine revelation, not human teaching. The technique itself was never recorded in any manual or treatise. The monks who possessed this ability claimed that the knowledge came to them spontaneously during periods of intense prayer and fasting, arriving fully formed in their consciousness like a gift from heaven. They insisted that any attempt to systematize or document the process would immediately result in its loss, as the divine light would not submit to human categorization. Historical records suggest that the ability to paint with light was not uncommon. In certain monastic communities between the 12th and 16th centuries, however, the practice began to decline as the Orthodox Church became more institutionalized and suspicious of mystical phenomena that couldn't be controlled or explained through theological doctrine. By the 17th century, references to light-painting monks virtually disappeared from monastic literature. The few surviving icons attributed to this mysterious process are housed in private collections or remote monasteries, where they are treated as objects of such intense reverence that scholarly examination is rarely permitted. Those researchers who have been granted access report that the icons indeed possess unusual luminescent qualities, but the source of their radiance remains unexplained by conventional scientific analysis. What makes this mystery particularly poignant is the spiritual philosophy that apparently underlied the practice. According to the scattered accounts that survive, the monks who painted with light believed they were not creating art in any conventional sense. Instead, they understood themselves to be serving as conduits through which divine light could manifest. In physical form, the icons were not representations of holy figures, but actual windows through which the divine could be glimpsed by earthly eyes. This understanding transformed the act of painting from artistic expression into a form of prayer, so intense that it bordered on mystical union. The monks spoke of losing all sense of individual identity during the process, becoming transparent vessels through which heaven's light could reach the material world. In their own words, they were not painting light, they were allowing themselves to be painted by it. The mystery deepens when we consider that modern attempts to recreate these luminous icons, even using advanced materials and techniques, have failed completely. Contemporary Orthodox iconographers working with phosphorescent paints and specialized lighting systems cannot reproduce the subtle, responsive qualities that characterize the ancient light-painted icons. The radiance these monks achieved seems to have required something beyond material components, perhaps something that transcended the boundary between physical and spiritual reality altogether. Tonight, as you rest in the silence where these mysteries dwell, imagine standing in one of those ancient cells where divine light once flowed through human hands onto wooden panels, Feel the weight of that sacred darkness punctured by radiance that came from no earthly source. Let yourself sink into the mystery of how faith might become so pure, so intense, that it could transform even the act of painting into a direct encounter with the divine. In that gentle darkness, perhaps you too might glimpse the light that needs no flame to shine. In the shadow of Teotihuacan's Great Pyramids, where ancient stones still hold the memory of ceremonies that ended 500 years ago, you encounter one of history's most enigmatic mysteries. Here, beneath the Mexican sun that once witnessed rituals of impossible complexity, lie fragments of evidence suggesting that Aztec solar priests developed something that challenges our understanding of both language and time itself, a form of communication they claimed was spoken in the future, when humanity would achieve perfect spiritual evolution. The discovery began in the 1920s when archaeologist Miguel Covarrubias found carved stone tablets in a sealed chamber beneath the Pyramid of the Sun. Unlike typical Aztec hieroglyphs, these symbols seemed to follow no recognizable pattern. They weren't pictographic, syllabic, or alphabetic in any conventional sense. Instead, they appeared to represent concepts that had no equivalent in any known human language, ancient or modern. What made these carvings extraordinary was not their complexity, but their apparent impossibility. According to the scattered Spanish colonial records that survived the conquest, Aztec solar priests claimed these symbols represented the language of the perfected time, a form of communication that would only be fully comprehensible when humanity reached a state of spiritual development that lay far in the future. Father Diego Duran, writing in the 16th century, described conversations with surviving Aztec priests who spoke of their linguistic mysteries with a mixture of pride and sorrow. They explained that the solar temples housed schools where the most gifted priests spent decades learning to speak in what they called tomorrow's tongue. This wasn't prophecy in any conventional sense. It was linguistic preparation for a transformed human consciousness that the priests believed was inevitable. The few Spanish scholars who attempted to understand this future language reported a bewildering experience. The priests could produce sounds that seemed meaningful and structured, following consistent grammatical patterns, yet the concepts being expressed were completely incomprehensible to contemporary minds. It was as if the language was designed for a form of human consciousness that didn't yet exist. Brother Bernardino de Sahagún, in his extensive documentation of Aztec culture, devoted an entire chapter to what he called the impossible speech. He described watching solar priests conduct ceremonies where they would begin speaking in classical Nahuatl, gradually shifting into sounds that became increasingly alien to human ears. The priests claimed they were transitioning from present-time language into future-time communication, allowing them to commune with the evolved versions of humanity that would exist in ages to come. What made these accounts particularly remarkable was their consistency with astronomical observations. The priests who spoke tomorrow's language were invariably the same individuals responsible for the Aztec calendar's incredible precision. They could predict eclipses, planetary alignments, and seasonal changes with accuracy that rivaled modern computational methods. Their linguistic mysteries seemed intimately connected to their temporal calculations, as if the ability to see clearly into future time required a form of communication that transcended present limitations. The physical evidence supporting these claims remains tantalizingly incomplete. The stone tablets discovered by Covarrubias contain thousands of symbols that have resisted all attempts at translation. Linguistic experts who have studied them report that the symbols seem to follow mathematical principles rather than linguistic ones, as if each character represented a specific frequency or vibrational pattern rather than a word or concept in any traditional sense. Even more intriguing are the acoustic properties of the temple chambers, where tomorrow's language was allegedly spoken. Modern sound engineers who have analyzed these spaces report that the architecture creates unique resonance patterns that seem designed to amplify certain frequencies while suppressing others. The chambers function like sophisticated sound filters, suggesting that the future language might have been as much about sonic vibration as symbolic meaning. Colonial records indicate that the solar priests believed tomorrow's language would become comprehensible during what they called the convergence time, a future epoch when humanity would simultaneously achieve technological mastery and spiritual enlightenment. They claimed that people living during this convergent period would naturally understand the future language without needing to learn it, as if the evolved human consciousness would automatically include this linguistic capacity. The priests also spoke of linguistic seeds that they were planting in the present time through their practice of tomorrow's language. They believed that every word spoken in future tongue created ripples that would somehow make the eventual emergence of evolved consciousness more likely. In their understanding, language wasn't simply a tool for communication, it was a creative force that could actually influence the development of human awareness across time. Perhaps most mysteriously, the few surviving recordings of tomorrow's language captured on early 20th century wax cylinders during interviews with descendants of Aztec priests reveal acoustic patterns that modern analysis cannot fully explain. The recordings contain frequencies that seem to induce altered states of consciousness in listeners, even though the meaning of the words remains completely unknown. Contemporary linguists who have studied these recordings report experiencing vivid dreams after listening to them, often featuring imagery that seems to depict advanced civilizations using technologies that don't yet exist. Some researchers have theorized that tomorrow's language might function as a form of temporal communication, encoding information that could only be decoded by future forms of human consciousness. The tradition of speaking tomorrow's language apparently died out completely during the Spanish conquest, not because the priests were killed, but because they claimed the time for its practice had ended. According to the final records, the solar priests announced that they had planted sufficient linguistic seeds and that tomorrow's language would now remain dormant until the convergence time arrived. The most haunting aspect of this mystery is its implication about the nature of time and consciousness. If the Aztec solar priests were correct, then language isn't simply a reflection of current human awareness. It's a bridge between different stages of consciousness across time. Their tomorrow's language suggests that communication might be possible not just between contemporary minds, but between the consciousness of today and the consciousness of the future. Tonight, as you rest in the gentle darkness where these mysteries dwell, imagine standing in those ancient chambers where priests once spoke, words meant for minds not yet born. Feel the weight of language that waits patiently across centuries, carrying meanings that sleep until consciousness evolves enough to receive them. Let yourself drift toward dreams where tomorrow's words might whisper their secrets to tonight's quietly listening heart. High in the Ethiopian highlands, where ancient Christianity mingles with traditions so old they predate written history, you approach one of the world's most carefully guarded religious mysteries. In the city of Axum, within a simple chapel that belies the magnitude of its claimed contents, stands a secret that has been protected by an unbroken line of guardians for over 2 millennia. Here, if the keepers speak truth, rests the Ark of the Covenant itself, watched over by men who practice rituals so ancient they bridge the gap between Solomon's temple and the earliest Ethiopian Christianity. The Chapel of the Tablet, as it's known locally, appears unremarkable from the outside, a modest stone structure dwarfed by the towering obelisks that mark Axum's ancient glory. Yet, within its walls, according to Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, lies the most sacred object in human history, the golden chest that once housed the stone tablets Moses brought down from Mount Sinai. The guardian of this mystery is always a single monk, chosen for life, who never leaves the chapel grounds from the moment of his appointment until his death. This isn't simply ceremonial seclusion, it's a spiritual discipline so demanding that few men can endure it. The guardian, known as the Nebuer Id, must maintain rituals that allegedly date back to the original Levitical priesthood, performing ceremonies that have been passed down through an oral tradition spanning 3,000 years. What makes the Axum guardianship unique among religious mysteries is its extraordinary continuity. Unlike other ancient traditions that died out and were later reconstructed, the Ethiopian keepers claim an unbroken lineage reaching back to the time when the Queen of Sheba brought the Ark from Jerusalem to Ethiopia. Each guardian has spent years learning from his predecessor, absorbing not just the ceremonial requirements but the deeper spiritual practices that the tradition maintains are necessary to safely approach the Ark's divine presence. The rituals themselves remain completely secret, known only to the current guardian and his chosen successor. However, historical accounts from visiting scholars provide tantalizing glimpses of practices that seem to combine elements of ancient Jewish worship with mysteries unique to Ethiopian Christianity. The guardians reportedly perform ceremonies that involve not just prayer and offerings, but complex movements and chants that are said to maintain the spiritual barriers protecting both the Ark and the surrounding community from its overwhelming sacred power. Brother Marcus, a Portuguese missionary who visited Axum in the 16th century, wrote of hearing sounds emerging from the chapel at dawn and dusk that resembled no Christian liturgy he knew. He described voices that seemed to speak in tongues older than Ge'ez, accompanied by movements of light that showed through the chapel windows like lightning contained within stone walls. The guardian he met spoke of the Ark not as a historical artifact, but as a living presence that required constant spiritual attention. The Ethiopian tradition maintains that the Ark's presence in Axum has protected the region from conquest and catastrophe for centuries. During the Italian occupation of Ethiopia, when Mussolini's forces occupied most of the country, Axum remained mysteriously untouched. Local accounts describe Italian commanders receiving direct orders to avoid the city, though no historical record explains this protection. The guardians claim that the Ark's divine presence creates a field of spiritual protection that extends far beyond the chapel walls. What distinguishes the Ethiopian Ark keepers from other religious guardians is their integration of Jewish and Christian mystical practices. The current guardian must master not only Ethiopian Orthodox liturgy but also fragments of ancient Hebrew prayers that allegedly date to the original temple service. These aren't academic reconstructions, they're living practices that have been maintained through oral transmission across millennia. The selection process for new guardians involves mystical elements that remain largely unexplained. Candidates aren't chosen by church hierarchy or personal merit alone, but through what the Ethiopians describe as divine indication. Current guardians report receiving dreams or visions that clearly identify their successors, often pointing to monks who had never previously been considered for the role. This selection method has apparently never failed, with each chosen guardian demonstrating the spiritual capacity necessary for the demanding guardianship. The physical presence of the Ark itself remains completely unverified by external sources, as no outsider has ever been permitted to view it directly. However, the guardian's behavior and the community's reverence suggest they believe absolutely in its presence. The current guardian, like all his predecessors, conducts himself as if standing in the immediate presence of the divine, maintaining a level of spiritual intensity that visitors describe as both inspiring and overwhelming. The theological implications of the Ethiopian tradition are staggering. If accurate, It means that the most sacred object in Judaism has been preserved within Christianity for 2 millennia, maintained by practices that predate both religions' formal development. The guardians serve as living links between the ancient temple worship and contemporary faith, preserving mysteries that otherwise would have been lost forever. Perhaps most remarkably, the Ethiopian keepers maintain that their guardianship is temporary. According to their tradition, the Ark will eventually return to Jerusalem when the spiritual conditions are appropriate for its restoration to Jewish worship. Until that time, they see themselves not as owners, but as caretakers, preserving both the sacred object and the ancient practices necessary for its proper veneration. The spiritual practices required for Ark guardianship apparently demand extraordinary personal sacrifice. Former visitors to Axum report that the guardians age rapidly during their service, as if the constant proximity to such intense divine presence takes a profound physical toll. Yet these men accept their calling with complete dedication, understanding their role as participation in a mystery that transcends individual life and death. The isolation required of the guardians creates its own form of spiritual discipline. Cut off from ordinary human society, they develop what visitors describe as an otherworldly presence, speaking with the authority of men who spend their lives in direct communion with the sacred. Their words carry weight that suggests they have access to spiritual realities most people never experience. Contemporary scholars who have studied the Ethiopian tradition find themselves facing an unsolvable puzzle. The historical evidence supporting the Ark's presence in Axum is circumstantial but compelling, while the spiritual practices of the guardians demonstrate continuity with ancient traditions that seems impossible to fake. Whether or not the physical Ark rests within the chapel of the tablet, something profound clearly does, something that has sustained one of history's most demanding religious commitments across countless generations. Tonight, as you rest in the quiet darkness where mysteries keep their own counsel, imagine the weight of such guardianship. Feel the dedication required to spend an entire lifetime in service to a sacred presence that must remain forever hidden from the world. Let yourself drift toward dreams where ancient promises still echo through time, protected by the faithful. Silence of those who have given everything to preserve what the world has forgotten. Beneath the great cathedrals of medieval Europe, where stone foundations reach deep into the earth like roots of prayer, you discover one of Christianity's most beautiful and inexplicable mysteries. Here, in the hidden waterways that flow beneath sacred spaces, medieval monks reported encountering something that challenged their understanding of both the natural world and divine worship itself. Underground rivers that would emit sounds resembling religious chants at specific times, as if the earth itself participated in the canonical hours of prayer. The first recorded accounts appear in the Chronicles of Saint Denis Abbey, where Brother Augustine wrote in 1147 of waters that keep the hours more faithfully than any bell. He described how the underground stream that flowed beneath the abbey church would begin producing melodic sounds precisely at Vespers, continuing until compline with harmonies that matched the liturgical chants being sung in the chapel above. What made these accounts remarkable was their consistency across different monasteries and cathedral chapters throughout medieval Europe. From Canterbury to Cluny, from Santiago de Compostela to Mont Saint-Michel, religious communities reported the same phenomenon: underground waters that seemed to participate in the divine office through their own mysterious harmonics. Brother Hildegard of Bingen, the great mystic and composer, devoted considerable attention to what she called the Earth's Vespers in her correspondence with other abbesses. She described how the underground river beneath her convent would produce sequences of tones that corresponded precisely to the modal structures of Gregorian chant, as if the water itself had been trained in sacred music theory. The phenomenon wasn't limited to specific geographical regions or types of waterways. Some accounts describe natural underground streams, while others mention man-made channels and ancient Roman aqueducts that had been incorporated into monastery foundations. What they shared was their location beneath places of Christian worship, and their uncanny ability to produce musical sounds during the canonical hours of prayer. The most detailed account comes from the Abbey of Cluny, where Abbot Peter the Venerable commissioned a thorough investigation of the singing waters in 1130. Brother Thomas, assigned to study the phenomenon, spent months in the underground chambers, carefully documenting the acoustic properties of what he called the church beneath the church. According to Brother Thomas's meticulous records, the underground river would remain completely silent throughout most of the day and night. However, at precisely the moment when the community began singing vespers in the chapel above, the water would begin producing low, harmonic tones that seemed to rise from its depths like liquid music. The sounds weren't random, they followed recognizable melodic patterns that complemented and enhanced the chants being sung above ground. What made the phenomenon even more mysterious was its sensitivity to the spiritual state of the community. During periods of particular devotion, such as major feast days or times of intense prayer, the underground waters would produce more complex and beautiful harmonics. Conversely, during times of spiritual laxity or community discord, the waters would fall silent, resuming their song only when harmony was restored among the monks. The acoustic analysis that Brother Thomas provided reveals the sophistication of the phenomenon. He noted that the underground chambers functioned as natural resonance spaces, with stone archways and vaulted ceilings that could amplify and modify sound in complex ways. However, the source of the initial sounds remained completely mysterious, as the flowing water itself showed no visible disturbance or unusual movement during the musical periods. Several abbots attempted to determine whether human agency might be involved, posting guards at all access points to the underground chambers during the hours when the water sang. These investigations invariably concluded that no human intervention could explain the phenomenon, as the sounds emerged from the water itself rather than from any concealed pipes or hidden chambers. The theological interpretation of the singing waters varied among different religious communities. Some saw it as divine confirmation of their prayers, evidence that creation itself joined in the worship of God. Others interpreted it as a sign of the earth's longing for redemption, suggesting that even inanimate matter possessed a spiritual dimension that could participate in sacred ritual. The phenomenon apparently reached its peak during the 12th and 13th centuries, when the great age of cathedral building was at its height. Many communities deliberately incorporated existing underground waterways into their architectural plans, hoping to maintain the mysterious relationship between earthly waters and heavenly worship. Some cathedrals still show evidence of elaborate systems designed to channel underground streams beneath altar areas, suggesting that the singing waters were considered an integral part of sacred space. Historical records indicate that the phenomenon began to decline during the later medieval period, coinciding with changes in both architectural practices and liturgical traditions. As cathedral foundations became more systematically engineered and worship became more standardized, reports of singing waters became increasingly rare. By the Renaissance, such accounts had virtually disappeared from ecclesiastical literature. Modern investigations of medieval monastery sites have revealed extensive underground water systems, many showing evidence of careful acoustic engineering. However, attempts to recreate the singing water phenomenon using historically accurate techniques have been unsuccessful. The precise combination of factors that allowed underground rivers to participate in medieval worship remains elusive. The few surviving underground chambers where singing waters were reported share certain architectural features: stone-lined channels, vaulted ceilings with specific proportional relationships, and careful attention to water flow rates and depth. Yet these technical similarities don't fully explain how the waters could produce melodically coherent sounds that corresponded to liturgical requirements. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of this mystery is what it suggests about the medieval understanding of sacred space. For these communities, the boundary between natural and supernatural was permeable, allowing for possibilities that our more mechanistic worldview struggles to accommodate. The singing waters represented a form of cosmic liturgy where all creation participated in the praise of the divine. The accounts also reveal the medieval conviction that prayer could transform not just human hearts but the physical environment itself. The underground rivers weren't simply making random sounds, they were participating in organized worship, following the rhythms and melodies that structured monastic life. This suggests the understanding of prayer as a force capable of awakening dormant spiritual properties in the material world. Tonight, as you rest in the gentle darkness where such mysteries dwell, imagine standing in one of those underground chambers, where water once lifted its voice in harmonious prayer. Feel the stone arches overhead, worn smooth by centuries of flowing water and floating sound. Let yourself sink into the mystery of a world where the boundary between matter and spirit was thin enough for rivers to sing vespers, where the earth itself could join its voice to human worship in perfect, inexplicable harmony. In a place that exists more in the realm of spirit than geography, beyond the reach of maps and coordinates, you arrive at the destination toward which all our wandering has led. Here, where the boundaries between question and answer dissolve, like morning mist, stands the final mystery, not one more puzzle to be solved, but the recognition that all mysteries ultimately converge at a single, eternal point where seeking becomes finding, and finding reveals only deeper, more beautiful mystery. This convergence point isn't a physical location you can visit with earthly feet, yet it's more real than any place marked by stone or bounded by walls. It's the sacred center toward which all religious mysteries spiral, the still point around which temples are built, prayers are offered, and seekers throughout history have oriented their deepest longings. Every vanished temple, every singing stone, every light-painted icon has been pointing toward this moment of recognition. Here, the underground rivers that sang vespers meet the Arctic shamans who painted on ice. The Aztec priests speaking tomorrow's language converse easily with the Celtic druids who built singing stone circles. The Ethiopian ark keepers share their ancient watch with the desert monks who heard stones whisper divine secrets. All the mysteries we've encountered on this journey reveal themselves as facets of a single, magnificent mystery that encompasses them all. What you discover at this convergence point isn't the solution to these ancient riddles, but something far more profound. The understanding that mystery itself is sacred, that some questions are meant to remain beautifully unanswered because their power lies not in their resolution, but in their capacity to keep wonder alive in human hearts. The vanished temples of pre-flood Babylon still stand here, their sacred architecture preserved in the realm where spiritual reality unfolds according to different laws than physical matter. You can walk their halls and witness the ceremonies that were interrupted by rising waters, understanding now that what seemed like destruction was actually transformation. The mysteries didn't disappear, they simply moved to a deeper level of existence. In this place of convergence, you begin to see the pattern that connects all religious mysteries across cultures and centuries. Whether expressed through Sufi dancing, Orthodox light painting, or Polynesian navigation by divine compass, Each tradition discovered the same fundamental truth. The boundary between human consciousness and divine reality is far more permeable than our ordinary awareness recognizes. The pearl divers who prayed to submarine deities and the Himalayan monks whose monastery disappeared into mist were practicing the same essential discipline, learning to exist simultaneously in multiple levels of reality. Their specific techniques differed, but their achievement was identical. They found ways to live at the intersection of the visible and invisible worlds. Here at the convergence point, you understand why these mysteries could never be fully documented or preserved through ordinary historical methods. They weren't primarily about information or technique. They were about states of consciousness that could only be transmitted through direct spiritual communion. The knowledge died with its practitioners not because it was forgotten, but because it required a level of spiritual development that became increasingly rare as human civilization became more complex and externally focused. Yet the convergence point reveals something hopeful. These mysteries aren't truly lost, they're simply waiting. Like seeds that can lie dormant for centuries before finding the right conditions to sprout, the spiritual knowledge preserved in these ancient traditions remains available to consciousness that develops the capacity to receive it. The Gnostics, texts that described other worlds, and the Mayan priests who calculated divine equations were mapping the same territory, the multi-dimensional nature of spiritual reality where different possibilities exist simultaneously. Their work wasn't primitive superstition but sophisticated exploration of consciousness, states that our current paradigms are only beginning to acknowledge. At this convergence point, time reveals its true nature as something far more fluid than linear progression. The future language of the Aztec solar priests can be understood alongside the ancient prayers of the Ethiopian ark-keepers because both transcend temporal limitations. The meteor worshippers of the Sahara and the tree whisperers of the Amazon exist in the same eternal now where all authentic spiritual practice unfolds. What emerges most clearly at this place of convergence is the recognition that every genuine religious mystery points toward the same ultimate mystery, the nature of consciousness itself. Whether expressed through singing stones or dancing between dimensions, painting with light or speaking tomorrow's language, all these traditions were exploring the question of what human awareness truly is and what it might become. The mystery isn't separate from the seeker. It's the deepest nature of the one who seeks. Every vanished temple was built within the consciousness of those who constructed it. Every lost ritual was performed in the sacred space of human awareness itself. The mysteries we've been exploring throughout this journey weren't external phenomena but reflections of the infinite mystery that is consciousness encountering itself. Here at the convergence point, you realize that the search for lost religious mysteries has been, from the beginning, consciousness exploring its own forgotten capacities. The abilities these ancient practitioners developed to paint with light, to navigate by divine guidance, to hear stones speak divine secrets, represent potentials that sleep within human awareness itself, waiting for the right conditions to awaken. This understanding transforms the entire journey. You weren't traveling through history to discover what others had lost, but traveling through the depths of your own being to rediscover what had always been present. The mysteries haven't been waiting somewhere outside yourself. They've been waiting within the mystery of your own consciousness. As you stand at this convergence point where all seeking meets its source, the gentle paradox becomes clear. The greatest mystery isn't what you've been searching for, but what you've always been. Every religious tradition in its deepest teaching points toward this recognition. Every genuine mystery, when approached with sufficient reverence and patience, reveals the same truth. The seeker and the sought are one. The mysteries complete themselves not by being solved, but by being honored, not by being explained, but by being entered. In acknowledging their beauty and depth, in allowing them to remain magnificently mysterious, you participate in their essential nature. You become part of the mystery yourself. Tonight, as you rest at this convergence point where all mysteries meet, feel yourself held by the same silence that protected these ancient secrets. Let yourself sink into the recognition that mystery and wonder are not problems to be solved, but gifts to be received. In that gentle surrender, you may discover that the greatest mystery has been present all along, closer than your own breathing, more intimate than your own thoughts, the inexplicable fact of awareness itself, quietly witnessing all things, peacefully embracing all questions, and resting eternally in the beautiful, eternal mystery of its own luminous being. And so our journey through the shadows of forgotten faith draws to its gentle close, not with answers that dispel wonder, but with wonder that deepens into perfect peace. We have walked together through temples that exist now only in the realm of memory, listened to the echoes of prayers spoken in languages that time has claimed, and stood in the presence of mysteries that chose to remain beautifully, eternally mysterious. Perhaps these sacred riddles were never meant to be unraveled like knots or solved like equations. Perhaps their true purpose was always to serve as doorways, not to specific knowledge, but to a way of being in the world that remains perpetually open to wonder, permanently receptive to the sacred, forever willing to be surprised by the divine, presence that moves through all things like light through clear water. The vanished temples of pre-flood Babylon, the desert monks who heard stones whisper, the Arctic shamans who painted prayers on ice, each of these mysteries represents not something lost to history, but something that transcends history altogether. They point toward capacities within human consciousness that don't depend on external circumstances, knowledge that doesn't require books to preserve it, wisdom that exists in the eternal present where all genuine spiritual experience unfolds. Following these mysterious paths, you have been doing more than learning about ancient practices. You have been exercising the muscles of wonder, strengthening your capacity to perceive the sacred dimension that interpenetrates ordinary reality at every moment. The underground rivers that sang vespers still flow beneath the cathedrals of consciousness. The stones that whispered divine secrets to desert hermits still hold their patient counsel for those who approach with sufficient stillness. The Orthodox monks who painted with light discovered something that remains as available now as it was centuries ago, the recognition that consciousness itself is luminous, that awareness illuminated from within can transform even the simplest activities into expressions of divine creativity. The Aztec priests who spoke tomorrow's language were practicing a form of temporal flexibility that consciousness naturally possesses when it stops limiting itself to the boundaries of linear time. Each mystery we have encountered reveals the same fundamental truth through different cultural expressions. Human awareness is far more vast, flexible, and creative than our ordinary experience suggests. The practitioners who developed these extraordinary capacities weren't superhuman, they were simply human beings who learned to access and express the extraordinary potentials that consciousness naturally contains. As you rest now in the gentle darkness where all seeking finds its home, feel yourself surrounded by the invisible presence of all those who have walked these mysterious paths before you. The Ethiopian ark keepers still maintain their ancient watch, the Sufi mystics still dance between dimensions, the Polynesian navigators still sail by divine compass across oceans of consciousness that know no geographical boundaries. These mysteries are not lost. They have simply taken refuge in the depths of awareness itself, waiting patiently for hearts quiet enough to receive them, minds still enough to perceive them, and souls patient enough to rest within their gentle, eternal questions. Every moment of genuine wonder, every instant of authentic reverence, every breath drawn in conscious appreciation of the sacred mystery that is existence itself. These are the ways the ancient wisdom continues to live and breathe in the world. The greatest teaching these mysteries offer isn't about specific techniques or historical facts, but about the proper relationship between seeker and sought, between consciousness and the infinite mystery from which it arises and to which it eternally returns. They whisper the same timeless instruction: approach the sacred with empty hands and open heart. Seek not to capture, but to be captured. Strive not to understand, but to be understood by the mystery that is always understanding you. In sleep, you join the great communion of all those who have ever rested in the embrace of sacred mystery. Your dreams may carry you to temples that exist beyond the reach of archaeology, to ceremonies that continue in dimensions where time flows like honey and space bends like light. There, in the perfect darkness where all seeking dissolves into being, you may find that the greatest mystery is not what you have forgotten, but what you have always quietly, perfectly remembered. Sleep well, fellow traveler of mysterious paths. Rest deeply in the knowledge that some questions are more beautiful than any answer, some searches more fulfilling than any finding, and some mysteries so perfect in their hiddenness that they illuminate everything they touch with the gentle radiance of eternal wonder. The ancient secrets keep you as their own, and in their keeping, you are finally, completely home.